Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining me here at Sleepy Stories. Tonight, we drift far across the sea to a land of quiet hills and misted shores, where the wind carries the old songs and stories live not in books but in the air itself. This new collection is called Whispers of the Isles, a gentle journey through the folklore of Ireland and Britain, tales born of tide and twilight, stories that once kept villagers company by the hearth, now retold softly for rest, for reflection, for peace. So find a comfortable place to settle. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the waves of your own heartbeat. You might hear the hush of the ocean beyond your window, or the faint cry of a night bird crossing unseen skies. Wherever you are, the night welcomes you, and together we'll wander into old worlds, softened by time and told anew. Our first story comes from Ireland, a legend as haunting as it is beautiful, the Children of Lir. Before the story had words, there was only the land, green and breathing, folded into soft hills and stitched together with silver water. In the west of Ireland, the mornings rose out of mist like quiet thoughts, and the evenings settled with the slow patience of a harp's last note. Lakes lay still as mirrors. The air smelled of rain and peat smoke, and if you listened closely, you could hear the ground itself remembering old footsteps. Lir was a chieftain of that place, not a king in the loud sense, but a keeper of cattle, of stories, of the shape a household makes when love arranges the furniture. He was tall in the gentle way, steady as a doorframe. At his hearth burned a faithful fire, and around it lived 4 children whose laughter carried through the house like bright birds. Their names were Fionuala, Aud, Fiachra, and Con, a braid of syllables easy on the tongue, the kind you say without thinking and only later realize you've been smiling while you spoke them. Their mother had walked the world with a light step and a compassionate gaze. She taught the children how to notice the small things the big world forgets, the sheen on a feather, the wisdom of a cow's slow eye, the way dew beads on a blade of grass like a necklace made for a fairy. When she grew ill, the house grew quiet in that particular way sorrow makes, not empty exactly, but listening. She left them on a morning so still it felt as if even the lake outside had paused to hold its breath. Grief rearranged the rooms. For a while it seemed every cup remembered the shape of her hand, every chair the weight of her rest. But time, gentle as rain, began to teach them how to move through the house again without expecting to see her turning a corner. The children learned the soft courage of ordinary days, feeding hens, carrying peat, fetching water that reflected their faces and then forgot them, as water kindly does. Lir watched and learned with them. He became expert in small tendernesses, the extra blanket straightened, the hand to the hair, the story selected to end just where sleep begins. Seasons turned their pages. Wildflowers rose and bowed. The red deer came and went like copper thoughts among the trees. People travelled the long road past Lir's house and said what people always say, you must remarry. A house as full as yours needs 2 hands at the hearth. Lir, who had 2 hands and 4 children's arms wrapped round his waist, nodded and said he would think about it. He thought more than he said. In time, guided by counsel and by the practical love that wants a home steady on its foundations, Lir married again. She was called Aoife. When she arrived, The house breathed differently, not better or worse, only changed, as rooms do when a window is opened on a new wind. Eve was lovely in a way that quiets a room. Dark hair, pale face, a presence that pulled the light toward her without effort. She knew the poems and the measures for bread. She knew the names of herbs that ease a head and of songs that mend a mood. At first, she stood at the edges of things like a person getting used to the sea, toes in, listening to the chill, deciding if this was her water. The children were kind. They made space at the table, moved closer at the fire, offered her the first slice when the oatcake cracked and steamed. Fionuala, the oldest, showed her where the hens like to hide their eggs. Aud demonstrated how to coax cattle across the stream without a fuss. Fiachra and Con brought her treasures their mother would have admired, a mussel shell flashing blue-black, a feather with the rainbow trapped in it, a perfect miniature nest fallen safely after its owner had flown. Awif returned each gift with a careful gratitude, the sort that sets a delicate thing down on a mantle and backs away so as not to jar it. She watched the children as if memorizing a language and stood beside Lir as if expecting to be tested on it. The house held them all. It had room, and yet there was a place in Awif that the house could not reach. Some griefs sit in the body like frost in shadow, even in summer. She had not known the children's mother, but the woman's absence was a presence Awif felt each time the wind lifted the edge of a curtain, or a child said, "Remember when," and looked at a corner where memory kept a chair. Awif did not begrudge love. She only did not know where to stand in a room where love had come first and stayed, invisible and faithful. Months passed, soft as the belly of a rabbit. Awifa tried. That matters. She learned the way Con liked his porridge, with an indecent amount of honey. She learned Fiachra's habit of pretending not to be tired and then falling asleep in doorways. She learned to braid Fionuala's hair without tugging and to spar with Aud's questions as if he were a bright, small lawyer arguing with the rain about being wet. But sometimes, in the late afternoon when the sun tilted through the rafters and made dust look like blessings, Awif felt a weight settle at the hollow just below her throat. Loneliness wears many faces. Hers was the face of being necessary, but not central. She was the new door on an old house. The house did not complain, but it remembered how the old door sounded when it closed. On such afternoons, Awif walked to the lake. It lay like a mirror someone had taught good manners. Reeds stood in thought. A heron stepped the way a prayer moves across a room. Awif would kneel on the bank and trail her fingers in the water until her skin forgot about fire and remembered sky. Sometimes she spoke aloud because the lake had the courtesy not to answer, and that made it a safe friend. "I am trying," she would say. "I am trying to be soft and seen at the same time." The lake held her reflection lightly, then let it go. Fionuala found her there once and sat without speaking. It is a skill to sit without speaking when someone's heart is tender. The two of them watched light move across water, a slow embroidery. At last, Oife said, "You and your brothers are the house's music, and you keep time." Fionuala answered, simple and true. Oife turned her face away so the girl would not see the way relief remakes a face. "Then I will try to be a good clock." "Clocks do not need to be loved," Fionuala said, smiling. "They need to be trusted. Loved things come to them on their own." Afterward, for a while, The days were easier. The house and its people met each other in better light. They learned shared routes, who boiled, who stirred, who stepped back at the doorway when the dog barreled through with the news of the morning in his fur. Stories returned to the hearth. Aoife even learned the old lullabies and sang them in a voice that made rough wood smooth. Still, the place beneath her throat sometimes filled. Sorrow, when it cannot exit as tears, seeks other doors. Aoife's sorrow travelled the corridors of her mind like a breeze that cannot find an open window. She began to fear that the love in the house was a lake in which she could wade forever and never be deep. One evening, a red dusk set the reeds on fire with colour. Lir, tired and tender, slept early in his chair, a book capsized on his lap. The children played a quiet game of knucklebones on the hearthstone, their laughter measured, the way laughter is when it honours someone's sleep. Oif watched them and felt the ache arrive. It was not jealousy like a storm, but longing like a tide, restless, persistent, sure of itself. She stepped outside into the cooling air. Moths practiced being stars around the doorway. The lake breathed in and out, a creature larger than the land knew how to hold. Aoif walked to the water's edge and stood very still. "If I could quiet the world to match the quiet in me," she said softly, "perhaps I could find my place." No answer came. None was needed. The reeds clicked. Far across, a bell from some distant settlement counted a number and kept the rest of its secrets. The next morning, Aoife called to the children the way someone calls to birds they trust. "Come," she said, "let's go to the lake before the wind learns its day." Fionnuala took bread. Aud slung a little flask for water because he believed in preparedness the way others believe in saints. Fiachra and Con raced ahead and then raced back because there is a kind of joy that cannot be spent all at once. They reached the shore while the mist still spoke in low sentences. The water lay like sleeping silk. Aoif's face was bright and calm, her movements precise as a weaver setting her loom. "Let us wash our hands," she said, "so that we carry the lake with us into the day." Fionnuala looked at her a heartbeat longer than usual. She sensed the note beneath the melody, but the morning was so lovely, and the reeds so polite, and Aoife's smile so composed that the moment folded itself away like a letter left unread for later. They knelt. The water took their reflections and held them as tenderly as a palm holds seeds. Somewhere a heron lifted, long and elegant, and the sound of its wings sowed the air to the water in 3 slow stitches. This is not the place where sorrow becomes a shout. In this telling, it remains a whisper, a choice made from a bruise, a longing that reached for stillness and forgot that love is motion. The day paused, as if listening for a word not yet said. Even the breeze seemed to wait in the reeds, ready to carry whatever came next across the water without judgment. And on the shore, the smallest ripple formed, then another, as if the lake itself were thinking. Far behind them, the house breathed. A peat fire adjusted itself with a soft sigh. Lir, in his chair, stirred and dreamed of rain on a hot roof. At the edge of the lake, a hush drew close. Awaf's hands were steady. Fionnuala's eyes were clear. The boys leaned forward, bright as coins. Evening would bring answers. Morning brought only the feeling before a change. That delicate, shimmering edge where one life becomes another, and the world, merciful, moves slowly to let the heart keep up. The morning began in quiet silver, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. A thin mist clung to the reeds, curling around the children's feet as they followed Awaif down the worn path. The air was cold enough to sting, yet still soft, the kind of cold that cleans the edges of things. Oifa walked ahead, her shawl pale against the dark green hills. Her face was unreadable, carved in thought, though she smiled when the boys laughed behind her. Fionuala noticed the way her step faltered once, as though she were walking both toward something and away from it. They reached the water's edge, and all sound fell away. Even the larks had not yet remembered their songs. "Look," Awifa said softly. "The lake has turned to glass. See how it holds the sky." The children leaned closer, their reflections rippling into motion. 4 faces, bright and familiar, and one behind them that seemed almost already fading. Awifa knelt. Her hands shook slightly as she cupped the cold water. For a long moment she said nothing. When she spoke, her voice sounded like someone remembering a story, not telling it. "I dreamed last night," she said, "that the world could be still, that love could stop moving and stay perfect." Fionuala frowned. "Love isn't still," she said. "It's like the wind. You can't see it, but you know when it's there." Oifi's breath trembled. "Yes," she whispered, "and when it leaves, everything aches." She stood then, a strange calm settling over her. In the distance, the mist began to glow where the sun pressed through. The air thickened with a hum, low, ancient, and not quite sound. Fionuala stepped forward, unease stirring in her chest. "Stepmother?" she said quietly. Awif's eyes filled with tears she did not wipe away. "I cannot bear the echo of your laughter," she said, "nor the silence when you sleep. I wanted to love you, but the love in this house already had a shape, and I could never fit inside it." The children stared, confused, the way sunlight looks at shadow when the world changes too fast. Awif lifted her hands, palms open to the sky. The air shimmered. The lake responded, rippling outward in wide, slow circles. From her lips came words older than memory, not cruel, not shouted, but weary. "Still hearts, still hands, become what the world remembers. Be beauty without sorrow, be song without rest." The wind rose and the mist turned white with light. The children called out, startled, their voices scattering like startled birds. The air folded inward, and the sound of wings filled the sky. When the brightness dimmed, where 4 children had stood, there were now 4 swans. Their feathers gleamed snow-pale. Their eyes, still human, still knowing, shone with confusion and grief. Awifa fell to her knees. The spell had left her hollow, its echo still ringing in her chest. Fionuala, the swan with eyes that still carried her name, spoke first. Her voice came not as sound but as thought that reached through air and heart alike. "Why have you done this?" Awifa covered her face with her hands. "Because I was small," she whispered, "and you were everything." The swans gathered near her. The smallest, Con, pressed his white head against her arm, as if to remind her of who she had been before the jealousy took root. Awifa sobbed softly. "I cannot undo it," she said. "The words are bound. They will fade only when love, unselfish and pure, touches the air again." "Then love us now," said Fionuala, "and perhaps the spell will break." Aoife looked up, eyes wide, but when she reached for them, her hands passed through mist. The swans had already drifted backward, carried by the lake as if it too had claimed them. Their voices rose together, a sound like silver light, a song not of anger but of mourning. The lake caught the sound and carried it outward across the hills, through every glen and hollow, until even the stones seemed to weep. Aoife stood alone. The spell had worked too well. Her heart had wanted silence, and silence had come, vast and echoing. She turned away, her steps heavy on the grass. Behind her, the swans circled in the widening water, confused but unafraid. Fionuala led her brothers toward the center of the lake, where the reeds grew thick and the air smelled of iron and rain. "Stay close," she said gently. "Whatever we are now, we'll be together." The mist thinned. The sun broke through, scattering gold across their feathers. For a moment, the world looked almost right again. Aoife, standing on the shore, watched until they were no more than 4 white shapes gliding in and out of the light. She whispered a single word, apology or prayer, even she could not tell which, and vanished into the trees. Some say she walked until she reached a stone circle deep in the forest, where the air remembers sorrow and time moves differently. There she faded into the mists, leaving behind only a single footprint pressed into the moss. Others say she became a grey heron, haunting the lakes for centuries, silent but watchful. But the children, the swans, remained. The lake belonged to them now, and when night fell and moonlight scattered itself like dust across the water, they lifted their voices in song, not of loss, but of endurance, a melody soft as wind through reeds, a song that said, "We are still here." The first nights were the hardest. The water was cold, the air sharp enough to make their wings tremble. At dusk they huddled close, their feathers brushing together, drawing what warmth they could from memory and from each other. The lake was vast and silver, stretching like a sheet of polished moonlight. They did not yet know its edges. They only knew that their laughter had turned to song and their hands to wings. Fionuala led them, her voice calm even when her heart ached. "We will not lose ourselves," she said. "We will still wake with the dawn and rest with the night. We will still love the world that loved us." And so they began to learn the new rhythm of their lives. Seasons circled. In spring, the reeds whispered and the water shimmered with the faint green of beginnings. Fiatra found joy in the flight itself, the sweep of wind beneath his wings, the wide arc of sky that opened like a promise. In summer, Aud discovered he could sing to the lake and hear it sing back. His voice rippled across the surface, echoing in patterns that soothed them all when the nights grew long. Con, the youngest, learned to sleep beneath the shelter of his siblings' wings, dreaming of fields and hearthlight and the warmth of a hand that once brushed his hair. And Fionuala, always watching, always steady, became their North Star. She learned to read the mood of the sky, to know when the rains would come and when frost would settle. She became the keeper of their hope. Years passed, and the swans grew into legend. Travellers who passed near the lake spoke of their haunting songs, melodies so pure that even the hardest heart softened to hear them. Shepherds left bread at the water's edge. Mothers brought their children to listen at dusk. Poets tried to describe the sound, but found their words too small. It wasn't sadness the swans sang, though sorrow lived in the notes. It was something quieter, Acceptance, perhaps, or the grace of continuing. One old wanderer, hearing them one evening, said softly to his companion, "That is not mourning. That is remembrance without pain." The swans flew in slow circles overhead, their wings flashing white in the twilight. Time, as mortals count it, became a rumour. The world changed, forests thinned, villages appeared where once there had been wild meadow. Bells began to ring from stone towers, their chimes meeting the swans' songs across the valleys. When men grew weary of fighting or farming, they came to the lake to rest. Some said they dreamed of 4 children, laughing by a hearth. Some said the swans spoke in their sleep, not in words, but in understanding. One monk who visited the lake every spring wrote of it in his small, careful hand. "They are not bound by time as we are. They suffer, yet they do not despair. They grieve, yet they still give song. This is how holiness sounds, not loud, but enduring." The centuries turned again. When the snows came, the lake froze, a sheet of crystal stretching from shore to shore. The swans pressed close together beneath the pale moon, their feathers rimmed with frost, their breath visible in the night air. Fionnuala sang softly to keep her brothers warm. Her voice was thin but unwavering. "Do you remember," she said, "the feel of grass underfoot?" "Yes," whispered Con, "and the smell of bread, and Father's voice when he called us in from the rain." Fiatra closed his eyes. "Do you think he would know us now?" Fionnuala looked at their reflections, faint and silver on the ice. "Yes," she said, "love knows beyond form. It remembers what eyes cannot see." And the ice did not crack that night. When spring returned, the thaw came with song. The swans rose from the water in a slow spiral, circling higher and higher until the lake was a silver coin below them. From that height, they saw how much the world had changed. Roads traced the hills, smoke curled from small cottages, the air smelled faintly of hearth and heather. They flew from one lake to another, following the ancient pull of their story, Lough Derivara to the Sea of Moyle and beyond. Wherever they went, the people gathered to hear them, unaware that the song they carried was older than any kingdom. Sometimes at dusk they rested on calm waters near a monastery's bell tower. The monks would stand at the shore and bow their heads, believing the swans were spirits sent to remind them of grace. Fionnuala would smile at that, or rather, she would feel the smile, though her beak could not form it. Perhaps, she would think, we are the prayer that never ends. Centuries blurred into one long melody. When storms came, they flew through wind and lightning, their wings bright against the dark. When calm returned, they glided through mirrored seas. They saw kingdoms rise and fall, faiths change names, languages shift like tides. But the lakes remained, and so did their song. Once, in a forgotten century, a little girl on a rocky shore watched them pass overhead. She lifted her hand and waved, and for a moment all 4 swans dipped their wings in greeting. The girl laughed, a sound like music, and ran to tell her mother. And somewhere in that laughter, the spell loosened just a little. When at last 900 years had nearly passed, the swans found themselves before a monastery unlike any they had seen before. Simple stone, quiet fields, and a bell that rang with a purity that trembled through the air. Fionnuala felt something shift deep within her, a warmth not of the sun, but of release. She looked to her brothers, Their feathers shimmered faintly, light gathering along their edges. "The time is near," she whispered. "How do you know?" asked Iode. "Because," she said softly, "for the first time, I am not afraid of what comes next." And as the monks gathered at the water's edge, kneeling in reverence at the sight of them, the swans lifted their voices one last time. A song of gratitude, of peace, of completion. The bell answered, its tone folding into theirs until the sound became one, sky, water, and heart bound together in light. The spell had begun to fade, and love, faithful as ever, had remembered them home. Morning broke soft and gold over the monastery. Mist lifted from the fields in long threads, like dreams unwinding from the night. The bell that had tolled in the darkness now hung still, its echo lingering in the air as if the sound itself had become part of the landscape. On the shore of the lake, the 4 swans drifted in silence. The monks who had gathered to watch spoke only in whispers, afraid to break the stillness. The water shimmered faintly around the birds, touched by a light that did not belong entirely to the sun. Fionnuala looked to her brothers. Their feathers glowed softly, edges blurring as though the wind was brushing them away. "It's time," she said gently. "Do you feel it?" Aud nodded, though his voice was low. "It feels like warmth beneath the cold, like something remembering us." Con pressed close as he had when he was a boy, his head against his sister's side. "Will it hurt?" "No," said Fionnuala, her tone quiet but sure. "Not this time." The pain was in the waiting. The monks began to chant, their voices simple and low, more breath than song. The sound carried across the water, weaving itself around the swans. The bell rang again, one long, resonant note, and the air trembled with its touch. The world seemed to hold a single breath, and then, as dawn spilled across the lake, the swans began to change. Their feathers melted into light, their forms softening, unfolding. The water stirred around them like silk being drawn from the loom. When the brightness faded, 4 figures stood in the shallows, human once more. Their faces were aged, lined with the centuries they had carried, yet their eyes were calm, luminous, with peace. Fionnuala looked at her hands, fragile but steady. She smiled, a real, human smile, and turned toward the rising sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "just as I remembered." The monks fell to their knees, awed but unafraid. They knew they were witnessing something holy, though no word they knew could name it. Aode reached for his brother's hands. "We have seen so much," he said, "so many worlds." Fiacre, his voice weak but tender, replied, "And still nothing more beautiful than this moment." Con, now an old man in a child's frame, looked up at Fionnuala. "Are we dying?" Fionnuala touched his cheek, her fingers light as feathers. "No," she said, "we're going home." They lay together on the grass near the water's edge. The sunlight warmed their faces, and the air smelled of heather and honey. A soft wind moved through the reeds, carrying with it the faintest echo of their song, not sad but full, like the closing chord of a hymn. Fionnuala watched a lark rise from the field and disappear into the bright sky. "We have lived 1,000 lives," she said softly, "and loved through them all." Her brothers nodded. None of them feared what came next. The spell had not broken them. It had taught them endurance, patience, and grace, the slow understanding that love is not bound by time or form. As the monks prayed, the light around the four figures deepened, turning golden, then white, and then they were gone. Not vanished, not lost, simply changed, like mist lifting from a lake at morning. Where they had lain, the grass bent gently as though under the weight of sleep. The monks wept quietly, but their tears were of peace, not sorrow. In the years that followed, the story of the swans travelled far and wide. Pilgrims came to the lake to listen, and though no sound was heard, many swore they could still feel a hum beneath the water, a vibration like music too soft for the ear, but clear to the heart. Some said that on calm nights 4 white shapes could still be seen gliding across the moonlit water. Others said the lake itself had learned to sing, its ripples whispering of love that does not end. And sometimes, when the bell tolled at dawn, the monks believed they could hear faint laughter carried on the wind, the laughter of 4 children, joyful and free. Time went on, empires shifted, stories changed hands, but the song of Lir's children never disappeared. It lived in the rhythm of waves, in the call of swans returning home across the sky, in the hush that follows forgiveness, and somewhere, in the stillest part of the lake, a single white feather rests on the surface, unmoving, eternal, marking the place where love remembered itself. The lake grew quiet again. Its song faded into the mist, leaving only a silver calm. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of salt, of distant tides, of waves speaking softly to the shore. Some say that when the story of the swans ended, the sea heard it and answered, with its own tale of longing and of love that belongs to both land and water. So we leave the inland stillness behind now and follow the pull of the tide to the edge of another world, where foam meets sand and magic moves beneath the moon. This is the Selkie Bride, a story of the sea's daughter who walked upon the earth, and the man who learned that love cannot be kept, only cherished. At the very edge of Ireland, where the cliffs drop steeply into the roar of the Atlantic, there was a small village wrapped in fog and salt wind. Its cottages huddled together like sheep in a storm, whitewashed walls weathered soft by years of rain. The people there knew the sea as both neighbour and God. They spoke to it as if it listened, sometimes thanking it for calm waters, sometimes pleading when the waves grew wild. One of them was a fisherman named Eamon. He was neither old nor young, but somewhere in that middle age where a man begins to see his reflection not just in glass, but in his choices. His days were measured by the tides, dawn nets, dusk sails, the slow rhythm of mending and waiting. He lived alone now, in a cottage perched close enough to the cliffs that the waves could be heard breathing beneath the floorboards. His wife had passed many winters before, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the sea seemed to respect it. Eamon was not a sad man, only quiet. He found comfort in repetition, the cast of the net, the pull of the rope, the familiar ache in his hands that told him the day had been honest. But some nights, when the wind sang through the gaps in his shutters, he would wake and think he heard laughter, light and lilting, like the sound of waves meeting rock. He would open the door to find nothing but moonlight on the water. Still, he always felt he was being watched, not with menace, but curiosity. One dawn, after a storm that had kept every boat ashore for 2 long days, Eamon rose early and walked down to the beach. The air was soft and heavy with mist, the sand scattered with driftwood and kelp. As he reached the cove, he stopped short. There, near the tide line, were shapes moving, figures glimmering faintly in the dim light. He crouched behind a rock, heart thudding, and watched. They were women, or something like women, their skin pale as sea foam, their hair dark and long, tangled with shells and ribbons of kelp. They laughed as they moved, light-footed and graceful, unbothered by the cold. At first he thought he must be dreaming, but then he saw something else. Lying beside the rocks, near their feet, were seal skins. Each woman had one, sleek, glistening, soft, with the sheen of water. When they wrapped themselves in it, they would fall forward, transforming effortlessly into seals, diving into the waves with a single fluid motion. But now, for this brief moment between tides, they were human, radiant and free. Eamon stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to blink. He had heard the stories as a boy, the Selkies, sea folk who could shed their skins to walk the land beneath the full moon. But no one truly believed, not anymore. And yet, here they were. He watched as they danced, their laughter mingling with the low hum of the waves. It was a sound that seemed to reach somewhere inside him, a place he hadn't touched since youth. Then suddenly, one of them turned. She saw him. For a moment, the world stilled, the waves pausing mid-crest, the wind holding its breath. Her eyes met his, and he felt the dizzying calm of deep water. She was different from the others, her hair lighter, her gaze steady, unafraid. She did not flee, though the others began to gather their skins. Instead, she stepped closer, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. Eamon wanted to speak, but words seemed too heavy for that fragile dawn. He could only nod, an awkward gesture of greeting between two worlds. She tilted her head, studying him, the corner of her mouth lifting in a smile that was both curious and kind. And then, with the ease of a tide returning home, she turned, lifted her sealskin, and vanished into the sea. Eamon stood there long after the waves had swallowed her, listening to the rhythm of the water as if it might still be her voice. Something had shifted. He did not yet know it, but the sea had chosen him, and nothing in his life would ever be quite the same again. The next morning, the fog lay low on the water, soft and pale as wool. The tide was retreating, leaving behind pools that caught the light like scattered glass. Eamon stood at the edge of the shore, his boots sinking slowly into the wet sand, and wondered if what he'd seen had been real. He had not dreamed in years, not truly, but that night he'd dreamed of the sea, not as he usually knew it, fierce and blue and loud, but quiet, alive, breathing. In the dream, a figure had stood among the waves, her hand reaching toward him, her hair silvered with moonlight. When he woke, the sound of the surf still whispered through his thoughts. Now, as the morning mist shifted and thinned, he scanned the shoreline. There was no sign of the dancers, no sound of laughter, only the steady rhythm of the tide and the call of distant gulls. He sighed, half with relief, half with longing. A story, he said under his breath, only a story. Still, as he turned to go, something caught his eye, a shimmer caught in the rocks, just above the tide line. He knelt and brushed the seaweed aside. Beneath it lay a fold of something soft and strange, Dark, sleek, and cold to the touch, it shimmered faintly even in the dull light, a seal skin. Eamon stared at it, frozen. The weight of the sea seemed to press against his chest. He knew what it meant. He'd heard the tales since childhood. If a man were to find a Selkie's skin, she would be bound to him, unable to return to the water until it was returned. He hesitated. The thought of power made him uneasy. He was a man who mended nets, who gave thanks for fish and wind, not one who stole what was not his. But the skin was here, real beneath his hands, and something in the air seemed to hold its breath around him. He lifted it gently, careful not to tear the delicate edges. It was heavier than it looked, the fur slick and smooth like river stones. When he folded it and tucked it beneath his coat, the air seemed to change. A faint hum in the wind, as though the sea had noticed. That evening the moon rose large and low, painting the water in silver. The tide reached farther than usual, lapping close to the rocks near Eamon's door. He was sitting by his hearth, mending a torn net, when a sound at the window made him look up. A soft knock, followed by the rustle of fabric in the wind. He rose slowly, his pulse quickening, and opened the door. There she stood, the woman from the cove. Her hair clung damp to her shoulders, darkened by the sea. Her skin shimmered faintly, and her eyes, grey as stormlight, met his with quiet recognition. Neither spoke for a moment. The waves crashed behind her, echoing her breath. "You found something," she said at last. Her voice was low, melodic, not accusing, but knowing. Eamon's throat tightened. I found what you left behind." She stepped forward, the lantern light catching the water beading on her arms. "And you kept it?" He swallowed. Then I cannot return to the sea." The words hung between them, neither angry nor resigned, only true. Eamon hesitated, shame stirring in him. "I will give it back," he said, "if that's what you wish." But she shook her head. "It's too late now. The tide has turned. My kind can only cross with the moon's calling, and tonight the sea has closed its hand." She looked out toward the dark horizon. "I will stay until it opens again." Eamon stepped aside, and she entered his cottage. The air changed, filled with the scent of salt and wild wind. She moved with unhurried grace, her gaze taking in the room, the nets drying near the hearth, the worn table, the kettle just beginning to steam. He offered her a blanket, but she didn't take it. "I do not mind the cold," she said softly. "The sea is colder still." When she smiled, it was small, almost shy, the kind of smile that feels like the start of a secret. They ate together that night, simple fare, bread, fish and tea brewed strong. She watched him carefully as though learning his habits, his pauses, the way he turned a phrase, and though he asked her name, she only shook her head. "My name belongs to the water," she said. "It doesn't speak well on land." He nodded, accepting the mystery. Days passed. The villagers noticed that Eamon no longer drank alone at the inn, that smoke rose steady from his chimney, that laughter, faint and feminine, sometimes drifted from his door. They gossiped in the way small towns do. Some said he'd taken a wife from the mainland. Others whispered that a sea spirit had ensnared him. But Eamon paid them no mind. His world had grown smaller and brighter. like a lantern flame in a dark room. The woman, the Selkie, adapted to land more easily than he expected. She learned to cook with herbs from the cliffs, to weave nets with seagrass, to hum songs in a language he didn't know. She never wore shoes, and her hair always smelled faintly of salt and rain. Sometimes she would stand at the window for long hours, watching the sea. "It changes every moment," she once said, almost to herself, "and yet it is always the same." Eamon came to stand beside her. "Like love," he said quietly. She looked at him then, her eyes soft and distant. "Perhaps. Or like memory." One evening, near midsummer, the two of them walked the shore together. The tide was high and calm, moonlight rippling across the water. The Selkie's bare feet left faint prints that filled instantly with foam. "I never thought I'd live this way," Eamon said, "to wake and not hear the house echo." "You are kind," she said. "Kindness is a rare anchor." They walked in silence after that. The sea breathed, the night hummed. When they returned to the cottage, she stopped at the door and turned to him. "You should hide the skin better," she said softly. He blinked. "You know?" Her smile was faint, knowing. "I can feel where it is. It calls to me, even in sleep." He hesitated, torn between apology and fear. "Do you want it?" She touched his arm. "Not yet." Then she leaned forward and kissed him, lightly, as if testing the air between two worlds. It was the first moment either of them stopped wondering what the other was thinking. Seasons turned. The village grew used to seeing her, always quiet, always kind. Some came to her for small remedies, a salve for burns, a charm against nightmares. She never asked for payment, only a shell, a feather, or a song. And for a time Eamon forgot to count the tides. But every now and then he would wake at night and find her standing at the open window, gazing out to where the moon touched the horizon. Her expression was neither sad nor yearning, only still. Once he asked, "What do you see out there?" She smiled. "Everything I am." He wanted to ask what that meant, but the words dissolved on his tongue. He only took her hand, cold from the night air, and led her back to bed. And so, for many months, they lived between tides, two lives folded together in the space between sea and land. Eamon did not know whether she was his miracle or his test. He only knew that every morning when he woke to the smell of salt and the sound of her soft breathing beside him, the world felt right. Still, beneath that peace, something waited. Quiet, inevitable, like the pull of the tide. Because love, no matter how gentle, cannot hold the sea forever, and the sea never forgets what is its own. The seasons softened into one another as gently as waves folding over the sand. Spring brushed into summer. The air grew full of light. The grass on the cliffs turned wild and bright, and Eamon's cottage, once a lonely shape against the horizon, began to look lived in. Herbs drying by the window, nets mended neatly in the yard, laughter echoing softly through the open door. The woman of the sea had settled into the rhythm of land life with a grace that both comforted and unsettled him. She was never restless, not outwardly, but there was always something about her gaze, an awareness that looked beyond walls and into distance. Eamon learned to live with that look. He understood that she was not a thing to be kept, but a miracle to be witnessed. Still, A quiet fear grew inside him, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers. He would wake sometimes to find her already dressed, standing at the window, her hair catching the first light, her eyes on the horizon where sea met sky. He never asked what she was thinking. Some silences he knew should remain whole. The skin, her seal skin, lay hidden in a wooden chest beneath the floorboards. He had wrapped it carefully in linen, thinking it safer that way, less likely to draw her eye. At first, it had felt like a secret the house agreed to keep. But as the months passed, the knowledge of it grew heavier, as if the very air had learned to hold its breath. There were nights when he dreamed of it. The shimmer of dark fur, the sound of waves breaking inside his own chest. Once, he woke to find the chest slightly open, though he could not remember touching it. When he knelt to close it, a faint scent of salt and seaweed drifted up, and for a moment he thought he heard the low hum of the tide, not outside the house, but within it. He pressed the lid shut and the sound faded. One afternoon he found her by the shore, her skirts damp, her feet bare and cold. The tide was coming in, slow and deliberate, and she watched it as one watches an old friend arriving from far away. He walked down to her, his shadow long in the slanted light. "You'll catch a chill," he said gently. She smiled. "The sea keeps me warm." He stood beside her. "You miss it." She didn't deny it. "It's in me," she said simply. "The sea isn't just where I came from. It's what I am. I can live on land. I can love here. But the tide still pulls, even when I don't answer." He wanted to tell her she didn't have to answer, that she could stay, that her laughter had made the cottage whole again, but the words felt too much like nets, and he had learned better than to cast them. So he only said, "Then let me love you here, while the tide still waits." She turned to him, her eyes bright with something soft and sad. "You already do." That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, they sat by the hearth. She hummed a tune that had no words, a song that seemed to remember other lives. The firelight flickered across her face, turning her eyes the colour of molten amber. When the song ended, she said quietly, "There's something calling. I can feel it. The sea is restless tonight." Eamon nodded. "Then maybe it knows we're happy." Her smile faded. The sea doesn't understand happiness, only belonging. She stood, crossed the room, and pressed her hand against the window. "If I ever leave, it won't be because I wish to. It will be because the tide remembers my name." He stood beside her, his reflection next to hers in the glass, two figures caught between firelight and waterlight. "Then let me forget it for you," he whispered. She turned her face toward him gently. "Love, you cannot forget what you never knew." Weeks passed, the weather turned, wind swept hard from the west, and the nights filled with the restless music of waves. The villagers spoke of strange dreams, of seals crying near the harbour, of silver shapes moving in the foam. Eamon tried to quiet the unease rising in him, but the house itself seemed to know something had shifted. The air smelled sharper, briny, and the floorboards creaked like the hull of a boat in motion. Then one morning he returned from fishing to find the door ajar. Inside the room was still. The table was cleared, the hearth swept, the kettle cooling, and in the middle of the floor sunlight fell across the open chest. The linen was folded neatly beside it, and the skin was gone. He ran to the shore. The tide was full, gleaming under the weight of the morning sun. At the water's edge she stood, the Selkie, the woman he loved, her sealskin wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her hair wild with wind. When she turned, her eyes were full of light and tears both. "I didn't mean to find it," she said softly. "It called to me in my sleep. When I woke, it was already in my hands." Eamon took a step forward, his voice breaking. "Then stay. Just stay one more day." Her hand lifted, reaching for his face. "If I stay one more day, I will never leave. And that would be wrong for both of us." He caught her wrist, his hand trembling. "You're my heart, and you are mine," she said. "But hearts are not meant to be cages." She leaned in, pressed her forehead to his and whispered, "You gave me the warmth of land. I will keep it, but I must go home." The wind rose, scattering sea spray across the rocks. She stepped back, let the seal skin fall around her shoulders, and for a moment she stood between both worlds, woman and seal, light and shadow, love and leaving. Then, with a quiet breath, she turned toward the sea and walked into it. The waves opened like arms to receive her. Eamon watched until the water closed over her completely. The last glimpse he saw was the flash of silver beneath the foam, one long, graceful arc, then nothing. He stood there until dusk, the tide curling around his boots. When the first stars appeared, he finally whispered her name, the name he had never been told, but somehow knew. The sea answered with a low hum, as if to promise that she had heard. In the nights that followed, Eamon often walked the shore alone. The cottage was quiet again, though it did not feel empty. Sometimes when the moon rose full, he thought he saw a seal near the rocks, larger than the rest, eyes bright as memory. And sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could feel the brush of her hand against his, cool and soft, like salt water in the dark. He never remarried. The villagers stopped asking. They said he had been touched by something holy or haunted. But he knew better. Love, he thought, had not left him. It had simply changed its shape. Far out at sea, beneath the silver light of the moon, a Selkie swam in deep, clear water. Around her, others called and leapt, but she swam quietly, eyes turned toward the distant shore. She thought of the man on the cliffs, his rough hands, his quiet kindness, the way he spoke to her as if the world were listening. And though she belonged to the sea, a small part of her heart still beat to the rhythm of the land. Years passed as quietly as the tide coming in. The seasons softened their edges, and the sea, which once seemed a living voice, became again what it had always been, constant, endless, and kind. Eamon aged gently. His hair turned silver, his hands roughened, and the lines around his eyes deepened in that way they do when a person has spent a lifetime looking toward the horizon. His days were simple. He rose with the dawn, mended his nets, spoke to the waves as though they were old friends. He still fished, but rarely far from shore. The world had become enough for him in smaller circles, the warmth of a kettle, the cry of gulls, the quiet memory of laughter in a house that had once been full of it. Sometimes the neighbours would see him standing alone at the cliff's edge, looking out to sea. "He's waiting," they whispered to each other, "for the one the ocean took." But they were wrong. He wasn't waiting. He was listening, because though she was gone, the sea had never stopped speaking. On clear mornings, he could hear her voice carried within the surf, not words exactly, but a feeling, a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, the same rhythm that had once filled his cottage, the same rhythm that now filled the space she left behind. He had come to understand that love does not vanish with distance, it simply finds another language. So, when he heard the waves crash with sudden force, or saw a seal surface in the bay and turn its eyes toward him, he didn't ache anymore. He only smiled. One evening as autumn returned and the wind grew cool again, Eamon walked the beach with a lantern. The seaweed glistened under the light, and the water reflected the first stars. He stopped near the cove, the same place he had first seen her all those years ago. The tide was rising, the waves whispered close, and for a moment he thought he saw something move, a shape, sleek and silver, circling in the shallows. He stood very still. Then she appeared, not as she had been, not entirely, not flesh, not dream, but something between. The sea had softened her edges, turned her body to light and motion, yet her eyes were exactly as he remembered. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Eamon lowered his lantern. The flame flickered once and went out. "I never kept you," he said quietly. "I only held the time you gave me." The Selkie smiled, a faint, knowing curve of lips that belonged to both woman and sea. She reached forward, her hand brushing his chest, and he felt warmth spread through him, the warmth of summer tides, of the world before loneliness. Then she stepped back into the surf, her body dissolving into foam, her gaze still holding his until the water folded her away. Eamon stood there long after she vanished. The waves rolled gently over his boots, the sky turned darker, and the stars came forward like witnesses. When he returned home, he did not light a fire. The house was peaceful in its quiet. He poured tea, sat by the open window, and listened to the tide moving beyond the cliffs. He thought of her often, not with grief, but with gratitude. How she had brought the sea into his life not as a mystery, but as a mirror. How she had reminded him that love, in its truest form, asks not for keeping, but for release. He understood now what the sea had tried to teach him all those years ago, that some loves arrive not to stay, but to awaken what's sleeping within us. That presence and absence are not opposites, but tides of the same ocean. And so, when the wind rattled the shutters or the waves struck the rocks too hard, he didn't feel fear or sorrow, only the familiar rhythm of something eternal, a conversation without end. In time, Eamon grew too old to fish. He passed his boat to a younger man and spent his days walking the cliffs. The villagers said he talked to himself, but those who listened closely swore they sometimes heard a second voice answering him, soft, low, and full of tide. One morning, after a night of gentle rain, his neighbours found his door open. The hearth was cold. On the table sat a single seashell, pale and glimmering with a trace of salt. They searched along the beach and found his footprints leading to the water's edge. The sand beyond was smooth, no sign of return. Some said he'd walked into the sea to find her again. Others said she had come for him when the tide was right. But those who believed in quiet miracles said the sea had simply taken back what had always belonged to it, both the woman and the man who had loved her. Sometimes on still nights, when the moonlight turns the waves to silver, the villagers say they can see two shapes swimming side by side near the cove, one sleek and dark, the other faintly luminous, human in outline but made of water and light. And sometimes from the cliffs, if the wind is just right, you can hear a song, low and tender, full of memory, a melody that sounds like love remembering itself. It drifts through the mist, over the rocks, and into the hearts of anyone awake enough to listen. And though no one can say whose voice it is, those who hear it always sleep peacefully afterward, as if some old ache has been smoothed away by the tide. Eamon's cottage still stands on the cliff. The shutters creak in the wind, and wildflowers grow through the cracks in the stones. Inside, the floorboards whisper with every gust of sea breeze. Sometimes a feather will fall from nowhere. Sometimes a seashell will appear on the windowsill overnight. And those who pass by in early morning swear they've seen a figure standing at the edge of the shore, looking out at the horizon, a man with kind eyes, waiting not for loss, but for reunion. But perhaps that is only the sea remembering their story. Because love, the true kind, does not end. It simply changes its shape and waits quietly for us to notice. The sea grows quiet now. Its waves retreat softly into the dark, leaving only a silver shimmer where moonlight touches the tide. Eamon and the Selkie are gone, their story folded gently into the rhythm of the ocean, a tale complete, carried onward by the whisper of waves. But if you listen closely, you might hear something else beneath that hush. The distant call of an owl, the sound of hooves on soft earth, slow, deliberate, echoing from somewhere deep within the hills. Because even as the sea rests, the land remembers its own magic, a magic older than kings and quieter than prayer. Tonight we follow the sound of that rustling wind, away from the shore and into the heart of the forest, where moonlight pools beneath oak branches and a single rider waits among the shadows. This is Tam Lin, a story of courage, transformation, and the kind of love that does not fear the dark. The road to Carterhaugh wound through a landscape older than memory. It began as a narrow path between mossy stones, then widened as it met the forest, a place where daylight softened and sound changed its shape. The air there was thicker, rich with the scent of damp earth, wildflowers, and something else beneath it, something older, like a secret breathing in the roots. No one entered the woods after dusk, not willingly. The people of the nearby village said the forest belonged to the fair folk. They told stories of travellers who vanished, of voices that sang from unseen glades, of gifts left on the moss that came at a terrible cost. And yet, even among those who feared it, there were some who felt the pull. One of them was Janet. She was the daughter of a noble family who lived on the hill above the valley, a woman with steady eyes and a mind that refused to be hushed. Janet had grown up hearing the warnings. Stay away from Carterhaugh. Do not pluck a flower there. Do not listen to the voice that calls your name. But warnings only drew her curiosity closer. Her life within the stone walls of her father's house was quiet, safe, and unbearably small. Each day followed the next like beads on a string, polished, perfect, predictable. Yet something inside her longed for more. The wildness she had never touched but always felt waiting. And so, one evening, as twilight spread its soft violet over the hills, Janet wrapped herself in a cloak of grey wool and walked down the path toward the forest. The trees met her like tall sentinels, their branches wove together overhead, letting in only strands of fading light. The air was cool and still. Somewhere nearby, a stream whispered beneath a veil of ferns. She paused at the edge of a clearing. Bluebells swayed gently in the half-light, their bells chiming faintly in the wind, and at the centre of the clearing stood a white horse, motionless, gleaming faintly, as though moonlight had taken a shape. Beside it, leaning against an ancient oak, was a man. He was dressed in green, not the bright green of spring, but a deeper shade, like shadows through leaves. His hair was dark, his features sharp, and though his eyes caught the last light of day, there was something distant in them, as if he were looking through her into some other time. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost curious. "You've come to Carterhaugh alone." Janet straightened her shoulders. "I have." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Most who come here do so by mistake, or not at all." "I'm not most," she said. For a moment he smiled, not mockingly but softly, as though surprised by the sound of his own amusement. "No," he said, "you're not." The forest held its breath. Even the stream seemed to pause. Janet felt her pulse steady in her throat. "I know who you are," she said at last. "You're Tam Lin." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, then resignation. "You've heard the stories." "I've heard warnings," she said, "that you guard this place, that you take what trespassers here." He looked away, his gaze on the trees. A fair enough truth. The forest has its price. Everything does. Janet took a step closer. "And what is the price?" He met her eyes again. "That depends on what you seek." The light dimmed further. The forest began to hum, the quiet sound that comes just before night truly falls. Tam Lin moved toward her, slow and deliberate, his footsteps silent on the moss. "Few come here without wanting something," he said. "So tell me, what have you come for, Lady of the Hills? A flower, a wish, a secret?" Janet hesitated. "I don't know," she said honestly, "only that I've been waiting for something, and I think it might be here." He smiled again, though this time there was sadness in it. "Then perhaps it is." He reached up to the low branch of an oak and plucked a single white rose, impossibly pure against the deep green. He held it out to her. "Take it," he said, "if you dare." She did. The stem pricked her finger, a single drop of blood falling to the moss. Tam Lin's eyes darkened. "Then you are bound to this place," he said quietly. "Bound to me, whether by chance or by choice." Janet looked down at the rose, then back at him. "If this is binding, then so be it. I would rather be bound to truth than to comfort." Her words seemed to strike something in him, something long dormant. His voice softened. "You speak as though you've been dreaming of freedom your whole life. Maybe I have. And what if freedom comes with danger?" "Then I'll meet it," she said, with open eyes. The forest stirred, leaves shifting, light flickering through the branches. A faint wind circled them, carrying the scent of rain. Tam Lin stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint shimmer along his skin, as though moonlight lived beneath it. "You should go before night fully falls," he said. "This is not a place for mortals after dark." Janet shook her head. "I'm not afraid." "You should be. And yet," she said softly, "I'm not." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Tam Lin turned away, his voice low. "There was a time I would have said the same, before the fairy queen took me, before I belonged more to her than to the world I came from." Janet's heart slowed. "You're a captive." He nodded. "A servant bound by her bargain. Every 7 years she pays her due to the world beneath, a tithe of souls, and I—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "I fear this year it will be me." Janet's voice was barely a whisper. "Can the spell be broken?" Tam Lin looked at her, something fierce and human rising behind his calm. "Perhaps, but not by me, only by one who dares to hold fast, even when I change form, even when the night itself turns against her." Their eyes held, and in that gaze something ancient passed between them. Not promise, not yet, but recognition. Two souls who had found in each other what they did not know they were missing. The first stars appeared through the canopy. Tam Lin stepped back, mounting his white horse. "Go home, Janet, before the Queen's guard wakes." She hesitated. "Will I see you again?" He met her gaze, his voice almost tender. "If you come when the leaves begin to fall, and if you truly wish it, yes." And with that, he turned, and horse and rider slipped into the forest's dark like mist drawn into shadow. Janet stood alone in the clearing, the rose still in her hand. The air hummed around her, neither kind nor cruel, simply alive. And though the night deepened, she felt no fear, only certainty. She looked down at the blood on her finger, at the white petals that had not wilted, and smiled. "Then I will come back," she said to the trees, and the wind, or something within it, seemed to whisper in reply, "We'll be waiting." Autumn came softly that year. The air thickened with the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the hills turned gold as though touched by fire. The nights grew longer, and the first frost clung to the edges of the grass, delicate, uncertain, like a secret newly formed. Janet thought often of the forest, of the hush beneath the trees, the sound of her own breath mingling with the murmur of the stream, and the man who had looked at her as though seeing both her courage and her fear, and loving both. She had tried to forget, to stay within the safety of stone walls and warm fires. But the more she tried, the louder the silence became. There was something unfinished in her heart, something that called her not in words, but in rhythm, like a drum beat far away that her own pulse could not ignore. So one mist-filled morning, with the first leaves beginning to fall, Janet took her cloak once more and walked toward Carterhole. The forest was the same, yet different, as though it remembered her. The branches seemed to bend slightly as she passed beneath them. The wind carried a whisper that might have been her name. She did not flinch. She felt no fear now, only that quiet readiness that comes when one has chosen a path and accepted its cost. When she reached the clearing, the white horse was there again, and beside it, Tam Lin. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the expression that crossed his face was not surprise, but something gentler. Relief. "You came," he said. "I told you I would." He smiled faintly. Few keep such promises. Few make them. she replied. He stepped closer, his gaze soft but searching. Do you understand what you've walked into? She met his eyes without wavering. Not entirely. But I know what I've walked away from, and I'd rather face the unknown than the cage of certainty. Tam Lin looked down for a moment as though collecting his thoughts. You speak like someone who's lived 1,000 years. Perhaps I have, she said quietly. In waiting. They walked together through the woods. The light filtered gold through the branches. The leaves fell in slow spirals, brushing their shoulders as they passed. Tam Lin told her pieces of his story, never all at once, but like fragments of glass catching the sun. He had been a mortal once, a knight of noble birth, proud and restless. One night he had ridden too far and fallen from his horse at the edge of this very wood. When he awoke, the Queen of Fairies stood over him, beautiful and terrible, her eyes deep as night water. She took me, he said simply, not out of cruelty, out of want. To her, love and possession are the same. Janet listened, her breath slow and steady. And you stayed. I had no choice, he said, but time moves differently in her realm. What felt like a year there was a lifetime here. When I returned, the world had changed. My home gone, my name forgotten. He stopped walking. Every 7 years, she must give a tithe to the underworld, a life to keep her realm whole. This year is the 7th, and I have felt her eyes on me. Janet's heart tightened, and there's no escape. There is one way, he said, but it is not safe, nor kind. She turned toward him. Tell me. He took her hands in his, warm, real, human. On All Hallows Eve, the fairy court rides out, from here to the crossroads beyond the hill. The Queen will lead them. I will be among her guard, cloaked in glamour. She will not know that I have told you this. He paused, his voice barely above a whisper. If you love me, truly love me, you must wait at the crossroads, and when the riders pass, you must pull me from my horse. Janet's eyes widened. Pull you from them? How? By faith, he said, by courage, by holding fast. He looked away, his jaw tight. For the Queen will not let me go easily. When you take hold of me, she will change my form again and again into things that frighten and burn. But you must not let go. If you do, I am lost. Janet felt the weight of his words, heavy but not unbearable. And if I hold on, then the spell will break, he said, and I will be yours, free and mortal once more. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the forest a low hum began, like a song too old to be sung aloud. Janet's voice was steady. Then I'll be there. Tam Lin looked at her as though seeing light after years of darkness. You don't know what you promise. I know exactly what I promise, she said, and I make it freely. They walked until they reached the stream. The water glowed faintly with the reflection of the setting sun. Tam Lin stopped and reached into the current, pulling out a single stone, smooth, round, the colour of moonlight. He pressed it into her palm. Carry this, he said. It will remind you what is real when the forest tries to deceive you. She closed her fingers around it. What about you? How will you know me? I already do, he said simply. The silence that followed was soft, not absence but connection. the kind that speaks louder than words ever could. When she finally turned to leave, the first stars were breaking through the canopy. Tam Lin stood watching her, his figure half shadowed by the trees. "Remember," he called softly, "the Queen's court rides at midnight on All Hallows' Eve. When you hear the bells of their horses, do not hide, stand firm, and no matter what happens, do not let go." Janet nodded once, her expression calm, resolute. "I won't." Then she was gone, her cloak vanishing into the twilight. Tam Lin stood alone, the forest whispering around him, the sound of her footsteps fading like the echo of a promise. That night, as Janet lay in her bed, the wind rose through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of hooves, distant but unmistakable. She opened her hand and felt the cool weight of the stone he had given her, and as she closed her eyes, she whispered to the dark, "I'll be there." The forest seemed to breathe in reply. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting silver across the hills, and the first leaves of autumn fell quietly to the ground, each one a countdown to the night that would decide everything. All Hallows' Eve arrived on soft feet. The day wore a thin sun, and the evening set a silver veil over the hills. By nightfall, the air grew crisp enough to chime on the lungs, and the last leaves let go of their branches without argument, drifting down like slow-burning embers. Somewhere in the valley a dog barked once, then grew thoughtful. The world seemed to fold in its edges, making a small, bright room for what must happen. Janet rose from her bed before the household stirred. She wrapped herself in her grey cloak and slipped a lamp into her palm, though she knew she would not light it. In her pocket, the smooth, moon-coloured stone warmed to her skin, as if it had remembered her already. She paused at the door, listening to the house breathe, then stepped into the night. The path to Carter Hall felt familiar now, though it carried a different weight. The ground was soft with leaf fall. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. As she reached the edge of the forest, the trees recognized her and made a quiet corridor, their branches touching overhead like the curved ribs of a chapel. She walked slowly to the crossroads beyond the hill, just where Tam Lin had told her the riders would pass. She stood there and let the night shape itself around her. No bravado, no speech, only breath. Only listening. At first there was nothing, only the hum that comes when silence gathers its skirts. Then a tremor in the ground, gentle as a heartbeat. Another, a distant ringing, not bells exactly, but metal in motion, bridles singing to themselves, bits tasting air. The sound came from the far side of the wood, growing nearer and more precise, like a line of ink travelling across a page. Janet rested her hand on the stone in her pocket. The world seemed to hold a cup of stillness to her lips, and she drank. The first horse appeared, black as a well, mane braided with moonlight. Its rider was slender, bright as frost, eyes like polished sky. One by one, they followed, a procession of beauty that did not apologize for itself, cloaks that remembered starlight, hair that recalled rivers, faces both young and ancient, none cruel, none kind, simply sure. They passed without touching the ground, hooves not so much striking as agreeing with it. Then came the Queen. Her presence did not announce itself, it simply clarified the air. She rode a white mare whose steps were the measure of the night. The Queen was not terrible. She was perfectly made, like an equation proven on a board. every line correct, every angle inevitable. As she moved through the crossroads, the forest leaned in to see itself reflected. Janet lowered her gaze. She was not there to challenge, only to choose. Behind the queen rode the guard, and in their midst a figure in green upon a dapple grey horse, head bowed, hands still, the curve of his shoulder familiar as a remembered song. He did not look up, but a pulse moved along the air between them, and Janet knew. Tam Lin. She stepped forward. The procession slowed, as though curiosity tugged lightly at its reins. A few of the guard turned their heads, amusement flickering like candle flame. Mortals sometimes wandered near for the spectacle, and the fair folk liked to be seen. But Janet did not stand aside. She stepped closer to where the air thinned around the dapple grey and reached up with both hands. Tam Lin lifted his face. In his eyes, a country of relief. Now, he breathed, though his lips barely moved. Janet caught him by the belt and the knee and pulled. It was not a violent motion. It was the kind an anchor makes when it chooses the earth. Horse and rider parted. Tam Lin fell into her arms, solid, human, heavy with years she could not see, and for one heartbeat all was still. The queen's gaze turned. No anger, only interest sharpened to a point. "Hold," Tam Lin whispered, and the word had scarcely left him when he changed. He became a serpent, cool and lithe, coiling through her grasp. Scales slid like wet leaves. Janet's breath drew shallow, not from fear, but from the shock of newness against skin. She wound the grey cloak tighter, binding the sleek length to her chest, hands firm, mind steady. "Hold," she said to herself, voice steady, and the serpent shivered and became a wild cat, muscle and heat and quick breath, claws tasting cloth. It pressed against her, testing for flight, then stilled when she pressed her cheek to its fur. "Hush," she murmured, as one speaks to a frightened thing. "I know you. I know you." The wildcat grew heavy and lengthened into a stag, a young king of the forest, antlers branching like winter trees. His weight bowed her knees, but Janet widened her stance and leaned the burden into the earth. "I will be your ground," she whispered, and the stag's breath warmed the air by her ear. Around them, the riders watched. The guard smiled as at an entertainment better than planned. The queen lifted one elegant hand, and the next change came like a note struck purely. Flame. Tam Lin became a brand of living fire, white core, gold edges, heat that sang of burning. The grey cloak flared where the ember touched, but the stone in Janet's pocket grew cool, and she held it with one hand while the other cradled the flame without flinching. She imagined a hearth, not a pyre, a lamp, not a blaze. "You are light," she said through even breath. "You are light that learns to warm." The fire quieted, drew in, changed again. He was iron then, black and cold, a bar from the smith, weighty enough to bruise. Her arms trembled. She thought of mornings lifting water, of years carrying expectations that were not hers. She let all that practicing come forward and take the strain. "I can carry this," she said, and the iron softened to something less certain, more fearful. A torrent of water surged where her hands had been. Tam Lin, a river twisting to escape, slick, quick, changing paths. It rushed along her forearms, seeking the ground, but Janet gathered it like silk and folded it back to her breast. "You may run," she said softly, "but not from yourself. The water sighed and became a living thorn bush, tangled, thorned, intent on convincing her to release. Thorns found skin, pain bloomed like small stars. Janet kept her grip, not tighter, just present. "You can't cut what is given willingly," she said to the thicket, and the thorns hesitated, uncertain where to be fierce. Around them, a breeze loosened in the trees, a sound like leaves easing their grip. The riders murmured, the way a quiet crowd does when it sees an answer arriving. The queen tilted her head, and for the first time a line appeared at the corner of her mouth, something like displeasure or disappointment or the faintest bruise of surprise. "Enough," she said, and her voice rang the air like metal struck. "Let us see if you can hold what wants to be nothing." Tam Lin became snow, dry and fine, a flurry that could not be grasped. It whirled in Janet's arms, stinging her face, trying to forget it had ever been a man. She closed her eyes and let the snow settle across her lashes, across her lips. She did not try to catch it. She made of herself a winter field and allowed it to fall. "I am here," she whispered into the cold. "Even if you disappear, I am here." The flakes paused in their frantic dance, as if remembering gravity. They lay quiet and melted. Melt became skin. Skin became hands and breath, and eyes she knew. A man's weight returned to her arms. Tam Lin folded against her, shivering once, then anchoring. Janet lowered them both to the leaf-soft ground, her cloak around his shoulders, her forehead touching his. "Home," she said, and the word was not a place but a decision. The queen's white mare stepped closer, close enough that Janet could see her own reflection riding small in the queen's eyes. The riders drew in, a ring of perfect witness. "So," said the queen, voice cool as new stone, "a mortal has learned to hold." Janet did not rise. She kept one hand on the nape of Tam Lin's neck, fingers steady in his hair. "My lady," she said, and the honorific did not taste false. "I keep what I was promised by love freely given." The queen considered. Moonlight pooled in the hollow of her collarbone as if it answered to her alone. At last she looked away toward the deep part of the wood where paths do not return. "Then take him," she said. "I can make 1,000 shapes, but I cannot undo the shape your hands have made of him." She turned her gaze back, a glint like frost passing through it. "Remember, girl of courage, holding is not owning. Let your love be a lamp, not a chain." Janet inclined her head. "I hear you." A pause. The queen's mouth softened into something nearly kind. "And you, Tam Lin, learn to stand where you have been held." With that, she lifted her hand. The court moved as one, a hush of hooves, a turning of faces, the faintest chime of iron. In a breath, they were gone, folded into the trees, unmaking their own sound, leaving only the ordinary night with its owls and its distant, satisfied river. Janet and Tam Lin remained at the crossroads. The leaves continued falling as if nothing remarkable had happened, as if the forest had merely turned a page. He stirred. His breath found a smoother rhythm. Warmth returned to his skin. When he opened his eyes, they were wholly human, and his first look was not toward the vanished court, but toward the woman who had refused to let him be anything but himself. "Janet," he said, her name not a plea now, but a prayer fulfilled. She smiled, not with triumph, not even with relief. but with that private joy people feel when a note finally lands where it wanted to all along. She touched the cool stone in her pocket, then pressed it into his hand. "Keep it," she said, "for whatever the world looks like next." They rose together. The path home waited, not a blaze of glory, only leaf-soft ground and the honest ache of used muscles. He leaned once, briefly, and she steadied him without comment. Overhead, the branches opened a little, and a slip of moon widened, generous as a blessing. They walked without hurry, sharing the quiet the night had earned. Behind them, the crossroads kept its secret. Ahead, a small lamp in a distant window began to glow, as if it had sensed the direction of their steps and wanted to be ready. The forest, pleased with its part in the story, let them pass. Morning came as if it too had been holding its breath. A pale mist gathered over the hills, softening every edge, turning the world to watercolour. The forest, which hours before had shimmered with the silver of enchantment, now seemed almost ordinary. Damp leaves, bird call, the slow drip of dew from oak branches. Janet and Tam Lin walked together through the hush, the first warmth of sunrise pressing against their faces. Their footsteps left small impressions in the wet grass, fading almost as soon as they appeared, like the memory of a dream too delicate to hold. Tam Lin's cloak hung heavy on his shoulders. The glamour was gone. He was simply a man now, weary, human, mortal. His hands, which had once glowed with the strange light of the fairy court, were rough and calloused. But when Janet looked at him, she saw something greater than magic, the kind of truth that doesn't need to shimmer to be known. They reached the stream at the forest's edge. The water was low, curling lazily around the stones. Janet knelt to drink, cupping her hands. Tam Lin followed, his reflection rippling beside hers. He touched his face, as though to confirm he was still there. "The air feels different," he said softly. "It's real," Janet replied, smiling faintly. "All of it." He nodded, still studying the water. "It's been so long since I've seen the world in daylight. The colours hurt my eyes." "They'll soften," she said. "So will the fear." He glanced up at her, his mouth curving into something quiet and grateful. "You speak as though you've done this before." Janet shrugged, maybe not with fairies, but with life. Her tone was steady, gentle, the voice of someone who knew the weight of choices and carried them without regret. They rested for a time beneath the trees, and Tam Lin told her what little he remembered, how the Queen's court had blurred his years into one long season of twilight, how time there did not pass, only shifted like wind through leaves. "She wasn't cruel," he said at last, "not the way your stories say. She was just certain. Everything she wanted, she made hers." Janet's gaze drifted toward the sunlight breaking through the branches. "And what did she want of you?" He paused, then answered quietly, "To keep me unchanged." Janet looked at him for a long moment, then said, "And yet change is what saved you." He smiled. "Yes, you and your mortal courage." She laughed, a sound the forest had not heard in centuries. "I didn't feel courageous, only certain." He tilted his head, studying her. "Certain of what?" "That love isn't something to be believed in," she said. "It's something to be done." The simplicity of it made the air still for a moment. Then Tam Lin leaned back against the tree trunk, eyes half closed. "If that's so," he murmured, "then you've done a kind of miracle." When they left the forest, the world seemed to exhale. The hills rolled out before them, mist curling at their feet. The village in the distance had just begun to wake, thin smoke rising from chimneys, the faint clang of a bell from the chapel. Janet stopped and turned to look back. Between the trees the light shifted, not gold, not green, but something that lived between both, a whisper of the other world that would always linger. She thought she saw a figure then, far away, the queen perhaps, or the shadow of her presence, not angry, not even watchful, only a kind of stillness, as though acknowledging what could not be undone. Janet inclined her head slightly, a gesture of both respect and farewell. The figure, or the light, faded into the trees. They walked until the sun lifted fully, drying the dew on their cloaks. When they reached the open fields, Tam Lin stopped. "What now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "you live. You learn how to be ordinary again." "And you?" "I was never ordinary to begin with," she said, smiling. He laughed, and the sound startled him, a laugh without magic, without fear, just human, free. He took her hand, the gesture hesitant at first, then sure. "You know," he said softly, "when I was changed, I thought it would be the fire that undid me, but it was your hands, your calm. You held me the way people hold light, not to trap it, but to keep it warm." Janet's eyes softened. "Then promise me you'll do the same. For yourself." He nodded. "I will." By midday they reached the foot of the hill near her home. The sky was clear and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and apples. The first snow clouds gathered far off on the horizon, promising winter. Janet paused and looked down at the stone he still held, the one she had given him the night before. It caught the sunlight, glimmering faintly. "You should keep it," she said, "a reminder of what's real." He turned it in his hand, the light flashing across his palm. "No," he said, "I think I'd rather remember you." She smiled, but shook her head. "I'm not what saved you. I just refuse to let you forget who you were." Tam Lin reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. "Then let me remember that too." They walked on, the village drawing closer, the day stretching ahead, uncertain, imperfect, alive. In time, the story of Tam Lin and Janet became a quiet legend. Some said they married and lived many years near the edge of the forest, their children playing where fairies once rode. Others said they parted, that love between worlds cannot last, only change its shape. But those who walked the Carterhaugh path in the years that followed claimed they sometimes heard laughter among the trees, or found a single white rose blooming in the snow, and sometimes, on still nights, a faint light would move between the oaks, not ghostly, not sad, but peaceful, as though the forest itself were remembering. In that memory, Janet and Tam Lin remained, not as a tale of rescue, nor as one of loss, but of balance, of what happens when love chooses courage over fear and tenderness over power. The forest, once feared, became a place of blessing again. The villagers left offerings of bread and milk at its edge, not to appease, but to thank, because they understood now that every wild thing holds both danger and grace, and that love, when met with courage, turns even curses into light. And so the story ends not with a farewell, but a continuation, the way all true things end. For love, once found, never truly leaves the world. It simply moves through leaf and wind, through the breath of morning, through every quiet act of bravery that follows. And if you ever walk through a forest at the edge of dawn and hear the soft murmur of water, the faint rustle of leaves, or a voice whispering your name, don't be afraid. It may just be the world remembering how to love. The forest falls quiet now. Its story has been told, its courage remembered. The last notes of Tam Lin's voice fade among the oak leaves, carried outward by a rising wind. For a long time, the hills keep their silence, the kind that isn't empty but full, the kind that lingers when something sacred has passed through, and in that stillness another sound begins to stir, a whisper that isn't quite the wind, a tone between sigh and song. Some say it's only the wind in the reeds, but the old ones know better. They say it's the keening of the bean sea, the woman of the fairy mounds, the Banshee. Her voice is not one of terror but of remembrance. She doesn't bring death but grace to those who must face it. Tonight we follow that voice, through drifting fog and quiet fields to an old stone cottage on the edge of Ireland's western coast, where one family waits through the long night, listening for a sound they both fear and understand. This is the legend of the Banshee, a tale not of fear but of love's final echo. The mist came in from the sea just after dusk, soft as breath, pale as milk. It gathered in the hollows and wrapped itself around the hedgerows, smoothing the fields into one quiet, silver shape. On the western coast of Ireland, where cliffs keep company with the wind and the ocean speaks in long, low sentences, an old stone cottage sat with its back to the hill and its face to the water, like a listener turned toward a beloved voice. Inside, a peat fire rested in its own slow glow. The room smelled of smoke and bread, and lavender hung to dry from the rafters. A kettle sang a steady note on the hook, and the old clock in the corner remembered the hours in gentle ticks. The cottage was simple, the way a blessing is simple. Everything needed, nothing extra, all of it held together by the patience of years. Maeve moved about the room with the careful grace of someone who has learned to put her hands where comfort will be. She laid another small turf to the fire, smoothed the hearth with the back of the iron, and glanced toward the bed where her father lay, dozing. The lamplight softened his face, turning the lines there into something like a map, a life traced in rivers and roads, crossings and returns. His breath was light, a rise and fall like tide in a sheltered cove. At the small table by the window, her younger brother, Aidan, mended a net, humming under his breath, the tune no one teaches, but the sea puts in the bones of those who live near it. He paused, listened, threaded the twine with steady fingers, and glanced at the window where the mist pressed softly against the glass. "Will it be a thick night?" he asked. "It will," Maeve said, turning the lantern wick down a fraction. "But a kind one." He smiled, relieved by her certainty. Maeve had that way about her, naming the weather in a voice that made it seem already tamed. She crossed to the window and opened it a little. The mist breathed into the room, cool and clean, and with it came the far-off hush of waves folding themselves gently against the shore. Aidan set the net aside. "Do you think he's in pain?" he asked, nodding toward their father. "No," Maeve said, with a softness that came from knowing. "Only tired. The way a good day makes you tired." They moved without hurry, the way people do when time grows tender. Maeve folded the blanket over her father's feet and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. The old man stirred, smiled without opening his eyes, and whispered something too small for words, perhaps a name, perhaps a memory. He had been a fisherman all his life, a man who knew the taste of storms and the place where gulls find the morning first. He had loved the sea the way some love a book, reading it daily, never finishing it, always grateful for what the next page would bring. "Listen," Aidan said suddenly. Maeve paused, one hand on the blanket's edge, and tilted her head. The clock kept its patient counting. The kettle hummed. The fire whispered in small, agreeable crackles. Somewhere outside a sheep moved in its sleep, and beneath it all, threading the quiet like a single silver thread through dark cloth, there came a sound, not loud, not near, but true, a long, low keening, a note between sorrow and solace, a voice that did not break the night, but opened it. Maeve closed her eyes. "She's in the mists tonight." Aidan swallowed. "The Banshee," he said, half in awe, half in the old habit of fear. Maeve kept her voice calm. "I, the Bean Sea, the woman of the hills." They did not move to bar the window or stoke the fire higher. They simply listened. The cry rose and fell, as if it were a tide of sound, drifting along the hedgerows, skirting the stone walls, pausing at gates. There was nothing sharp in it, no threat, only a depth that suggested the weight of 1,000 goodbyes, each carried carefully to its door. "Grandmother said her voice is a kindness," Aidan murmured, "that it comes before the parting, so the heart can begin to make room." Maeve nodded. Grandmother knew. They stood together at the open window, the mist touching their faces with the lightest cooling hands. Maeve laid her palm on the sill, feeling the damp stone. Aidan slipped his fingers into the curve of the net he had been mending, as if holding work might steady him. The cry came again, nearer now. If it had been a wind, it would have rustled the grasses. If it had been a river, it would have shown stars in its skin. As it was, it moved through the night in a way that made the world feel gently larger. Their father stirred. His eyes opened, bright and clear, the way eyes sometimes are when they have finally decided to look only at what matters. "Your mother," he whispered, and Maeve smiled. "She always did arrive first," Maeve said, brushing his hair again, "even at hearthside." He chuckled, a sound no louder than a moth's wing, and closed his eyes. Aidan, trying for bravery that didn't quite fit yet, said, "Do you think she'll come to the door?" Maeve shook her head. "She won't need to. We've already made room." The cry drifted once more, then softened, as though standing just beyond the gable, listening as they listened. Maeve thought of all the times a sound like this might have risen along these fields. The old keens given for those lost at sea, the soft singing at the edge of wakes that last until the candles tire. She had learned as a girl that grief in this place was never a thing to be hidden. It was to be held in the open air, shared and named and soothed until it lay down, warm and quiet, at the feet of love. She closed the window halfway, letting the mist remain like a thin veil across the room. The kettle sighed, ready. She poured tea and pressed the warm cup into Aidan's hands. "Sip," she said. "Let your heart keep time with the heat." He obeyed. "Will she stay long?" "As long as we need her," Maeve said. "As long as he does." The clock counted another minute and put it gently on the shelf with the rest. Outside, the ocean breathed, the kind of steadying breath that teaches others how to breathe. The cry returned, now shaped like a lullaby, and Maeve felt the small ache in her chest loosen as if someone had set down a bundle she hadn't realized she was carrying. "You're not afraid," Aidan said, watching her face. "I was when I was your age," Maeve answered, "because I thought she brought the end. But she doesn't. She brings the softening." "The softening," Maeve nodded. "So it doesn't break us when it arrives. So we can say the last things gently, instead of with our fists closed." Aidan looked toward their father, whose breath had grown thinner but not strained. It was the breath of a man who had reached the end of a long, honest road and could see the house lights through the drizzle. "Will you tell him a story?" Aidan asked. "One of the sea ones." Maeve smiled and pulled a chair closer to the bed. She spoke in the low cadence that calms the animals and the old and sometimes the storms. "Do you remember," she began, "the day the mackerel were so thick you said the ocean had decided to grow its own scales? You and Dar came up the path laughing like boys, your boots full of salt and your pockets full of miracles. The gulls followed, greedy as uncles, and he told you, what did he say?" Aidan, already smiling, supplied it. He said, "Never take more than you can thank for." "That's it," Maeve said, and he salted the fish with a ceremony that made the kitchen into a church. Aidan laughed softly and their father's mouth curved, hearing even what his mind no longer held. The mist at the window shifted as if settling in to listen too. The cry rose again, now so quiet it felt like a hand on a shoulder. Maeve thought of the old stories, the ones that said the Banshee came for families bound tightly to the land, for lineages with roots so deep that the earth itself kept an account of them. She thought of their grandmother who had worn a shawl the colour of dusk and could coax butter from milk as if convincing the world to be kind. She had heard the cry once, and afterward she had baked bread and said, "Let the house be ready." Maeve had learned then that readiness is not a barricade, but an open door. She leaned close to her father. "Dar," she whispered, "the tide's turning." He nodded, a slow, small motion. His eyes opened and found hers, blue, then grey, then something like the mist itself. "I hear the gulls," he said. "They're laughing at the wind," Maeve answered, playing the old game. "And the sea, reading us a story we already know." He sighed, and the sound was not tired, but content. "Good," he said, "good." The cry in the night drew nearer, then thinned, like a thread pulled gently through cloth. Maeve felt Aidan's hand touch her shoulder, a younger strength leaning into her older calm. The kettle had stopped its singing, the clock ticked on, unafraid. Outside, a sheep called once, as if to say, "I'm here to the rest." "Maeve," Aidan whispered, "do you think she ever cries for joy?" Maeve considered. "I think she cries for love," she said, "and love carries both." The mist at the window brightened almost imperceptibly as if moonlight had decided to join. The cry changed once more, became not a call, but an answer. It seemed to say, "We see, we witness. This is not a falling, but a folding." The sound reached into the room and laid itself across them like a shawl. Their father's breath slowed, paused, returned, paused again, a tide learning a smaller shore. Maeve kept her hand in his, and Aidan stood at the foot of the bed, thumb resting in the gap of the net, as if completing a stitch. The cry faded, not suddenly, not like a door closed. It went out the way a candle goes when the room is ready for dark, by consent. In its place remained a quiet that felt like devotion. Maeve closed the window and drew the curtain halfway, leaving a ribbon of night to watch over them. She sat, and if tears came, they came like rain on soft ground, welcome, nourishing, expected. Aidan breathed with her, finding the rhythm, letting his small grief be a river that knew where to go. Outside, the mist lingered against the stones, unafraid of morning. The sea turned in its sleep, and somewhere beyond the hedges, where the lane bends toward the chapel and the old thorn tree keeps its own counsel, a figure in a pale, wind-worn cloak stood very still, listening to the house the way a midwife listens to a heartbeat. When at last she lifted her face, there was neither smile nor frown upon it, only a serenity born of difficult kindness. She touched the air as if laying a blessing on the lintel, then let the fog take her back. Inside the cottage, Maeve whispered to the quiet, "We are ready," and the night, obedient, gentle, held its breath with them until dawn remembered the fields. Morning arrived without fanfare, a pale light, a low sky, and a stillness that held its shape long after the sun rose. The mist had thinned to ribbons now, trailing lazily over the fields and curling along the stone walls like smoke that had forgotten its fire. Inside the cottage the air felt different, not empty, not broken, simply altered, as though the world had exhaled and would take its time drawing the next breath. Maeve sat by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since cooled. She wasn't waiting for it to warm her anymore. She held it because it anchored her, something to do, something to keep between her palms while her heart rearranged itself. The peat fire burned low, the scent of it sweet and earthy. From the rafters above, a single drop of condensation fell from a line of drying herbs and landed on the stone floor with a sound small enough to go unnoticed. But Maeve noticed. She noticed everything this morning. Aidan slept in the chair by the window, his head tilted back, mouth slightly open, one hand still resting on the old net he had mended the night before. He had fallen asleep just before dawn after hours of silent watching. Maeve looked toward the bed. Her father lay as he had in those final moments, peaceful, still, his features smoothed into something that resembled both age and youth. The faintest smile remained at the corners of his mouth, as though he'd remembered something delightful just before the end. The blanket lay over him neatly, his hands folded on his chest. She had not yet covered his face. It didn't feel right to hide him from the day just yet. When the kettle began to murmur on the hook, Maeve rose and poured fresh water, letting the ritual guide her. She added a pinch of tea leaves, stirred, and waited for the scent to bloom. Every motion was deliberate, every sound a small act of continuity. She thought of what her grandmother used to say when someone passed. The living must keep the rhythm steady, so the spirit can cross without confusion. Maeve smiled faintly. It was a beautiful way of describing the ordinary, as if the whole act of continuing, of making tea and tending fire, were itself a kind of bridge. She carried the kettle to the table and poured a cup for Aidan, setting it near his elbow. He stirred, blinked, and rubbed his eyes. "Is it morning?" he asked, his voice rough. "It is." He looked toward the bed, then back at her. His eyes were red but dry. He went quietly. Maeve nodded. He did. She came for him kindly. Aidan looked down at his hands, tracing the line of twine still looped around his fingers. "I thought I'd feel something bigger," he said, "like thunder. But it's all so still," she offered. He nodded. "Aye." Maeve reached over and touched his arm. "That's how peace feels, Aidan. Not grand, just enough." He leaned into her touch, letting out a long breath. Outside, a raven called from the hill, its voice deep and resonant. The cry echoed, rolled across the fields, and was met by the faintest whisper of the sea beyond. The rhythm of it reminded Maeve of her father's breathing, of the way he would inhale the world and send it back out softened, better somehow. She rose and crossed to the window. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the faint line of the road winding down toward the village. She knew by midday word would reach them. Neighbours would come with bread and candles, voices low, eyes gentle. But for now, the house was theirs, a quiet pocket between the world's knowing and its arrival. She turned to Aidan. "Before they come, we'll wash him and light the candles." He would want to go tidy. Aidan stood, steadying himself with one hand on the chair. He always said the sea forgives those who keep their decks in order. Maeve smiled. A good rule for living too. They worked together, slow, careful, reverent. They fetched warm water from the kettle, linen cloths, a sprig of lavender. Maeve combed his hair with the small wooden comb he'd made for her mother years ago, its handle worn smooth from use. Aidan trimmed the candle wicks, lighting 3 and setting them near the window. Their flames wavered at first, then steadied, small suns holding court over the stillness. When they had finished, they sat again by the fire. The room smelled of peat and sea salt and lavender. Maeve looked at the candlelight reflected in her father's ring, the simple silver band he had worn since before she was born. The engraving inside had long since faded, but she remembered the words, "Ever returning." She traced them softly with her thumb. The hours stretched gently, neither long nor short. A few gulls drifted past, their cries threading through the chimney smoke. The mist lifted further, revealing the far-off shimmer of the tide. Aidan dozed again, and Maeve let him. He was still young enough to need rest when the world grew too full. She stayed awake, her mind not racing, only wandering, through memories, through silences, through the kind of thoughts that come when there's no need for words. She thought of the Banshee's cry, how it had sounded less like mourning and more like invitation, how it had carried the weight of generations, not one voice but many folded together. She wondered if the Banshee ever grew weary, carrying all that love disguised as sorrow, and then faintly she heard it again. Not the keening, but something softer, a hum, a tone that could almost be mistaken for the wind. It moved through the chimney and across the hearth like a thread of air, gentle and familiar. Maeve smiled, closing her eyes. "You came back," she whispered. The hum lingered, wrapping itself around the edges of the room. The candles flickered once, then stilled. In the quiet that followed, Maeve felt the faintest warmth touch her shoulder, as if someone were standing just behind her, resting a hand there in thanks. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. By afternoon, neighbours began to arrive. They came in small groups, each bringing what comfort they could: bread, broth, new candles, quiet company. They moved softly, speaking in low tones, their presence filling the cottage with gentle energy. Maeve and Aidan welcomed them with tea and calm smiles. The old women went to the bed, murmuring prayers. The men tended the fire, adding fresh peat and stoking it to a steady glow. And in the midst of it all, Maeve felt something, not grief exactly, but grace, a sense that everything was as it should be, that life and death were not opposites, but two breaths in the same rhythm. As the sun dipped toward the sea, the light through the window turned golden. Dust motes shimmered in the air, and the whole room seemed to glow. Maeve looked toward the hearth and thought, this is what the Banshee knows. That endings are only quieter beginnings, that love, even when it leaves light behind. She reached for the kettle again, pouring tea for one more cup, her movements slow and sure. Drink, everyone, she said softly. Let him go, knowing the house is warm. The group obeyed without question, each sipping in silence, each holding their cup as if it were part of the farewell. Outside, the first stars appeared above the mist. The ocean breathed its long, low sigh against the cliffs, steady and eternal. Inside the cottage, the candles burned on, flames steady, unhurried, carrying their small golden prayers into the gathering night. By evening, the mist had lifted into a high, pale sky, and the fields lay revealed, wet and shining, stitched with stone walls that wandered toward the sea. The neighbours had gone for a while, promising to return after nightfall to sit a late hour and keep the house companioned. Aidan slept again, gently, the way the young do when sorrow and relief share the same pillow. Maeve stepped outside to breathe the open air. The cottage door clicked softly behind her, and the world widened without making any demands. Far off, the ocean worked at its old patience. Closer by, the sheep tugged at the grass, heads down, unconcerned with anything larger than the next mouthful. A curlew called, that lonely, fluted note that seems to curl around the ribs and rest there. She took the path that ran between the house and the field, her boots leaving dark ovals in the damp. The breeze carried the scent of salt and peat smoke and the sweetness of crushed clover. She followed it toward the bend in the lane where the hawthorn stood, an old, bony tree that had learned the grammar of wind. The elders in the village called it the fairy thorn and left it to itself, no trimming, no cutting, out of respect for the ones who were said to pass by unseen. Ribbons from years past still clung to its lower branches, faded to gentle ghosts of their original colours. Maeve slowed. There was a feeling in the air she recognized now, the hush that is not absence but attendance. She reached the low stile and paused, one hand resting on the cool stone. The Banshee stood on the far side of the thorn. She was not close, she did not need to be. She stood as the mist stands, present, uninsistent, her pale cloak moving just enough to show the breeze its shape. Her hair, long and dark, lay loose over her shoulders, and her face was the kind that makes you remember someone you have loved, though you cannot place who, not beauty that dazzles, familiarity that steadies. Maeve stayed where she was. If fear rose, it was the kind that asks us to bow to what is sacred, not to run. She dipped her head, the old greeting for those who walk between. "Good evening," she said, her voice low and plain, the way you speak to a guest who already knows the way to your hearth. The Banshee did not move closer. A small nod answered, a ripple in still water. When her voice came, it was not a wind, nor a wail, but a tone that felt shaped by breath. "I do not intrude," the woman said. "I keep the edge." Maeve found that she was not surprised to hear words. "You were kind last night," she answered. "We heard you." "I came because you were ready to listen," the woman said. "Keening is wasted on doors that fear to open." Maeve smiled without showing her teeth. "My grandmother opened ours a long time ago." She touched the stile as if it were a hand. "And you, do you come for all?" "I come where the line is kept," the woman said. "Where names hold to land and land holds to names. Where love learns the sound of itself and teaches it to the children." She gestured, a slow turn of the wrist that included cottage, fields, sea. "This place remembers." They stood like that a while, the kind of talk that does not hurry because neither speaker has anything to prove. A gull crossed the sky, its white body briefly bright against thin sun. From the village, a gate clanged faintly, then fell back into its farmyard silence. "I used to be afraid when I was a girl," Maeve said at last. "They said your voice meant loss." "It means room," said the Banshee. "It means the living will make a space for the crossing. If sorrow is not given a chair, it will lie on the floor and trip you in the dark." She tilted her head as if listening to something further inland, then nodded to herself. "You have made a chair." Maeve felt the truth of it enter her chest like something warm. "He went softly," she said, "the way a tide leaves sand smooth." "That was his life telling you how to close it," said the woman. "Some must go as storms, some as weather remembered." They let the curlew's call pass between them again. Maeve could feel questions gathering, but they were not curious questions. They were respectful ones that wanted to be asked for the sake of the asking. "And you," she said gently, "do you tire of the carrying?" The Banshee's eyes, grey as wet stone, bright as a seal's back when the sun strikes it, met hers without defence. "Sometimes the voice is heavy," she said. "It is made of all the names. But then a house sings back, bread sliced thin, tea poured slow, hands on a brow, and the weight lifts. It is not mine in the end. It is yours. I am only a reminder to set it down beautifully." Maeve thought of the kettle and the candles, and Aidan's thumb hooked in the net to steady his heart. "We did our best." "You did exactly what was needed," said the woman. A breeze rose, lifting the ribbons in the hawthorn. One ribbon, old, bleached to a gentle bone white, came loose and spiraled down to catch on the stile. Maeve reached to free it, careful not to pull. She laid it over her palm and offered it without crossing the boundary. "For the ones you carry," she said. The woman did not take it, but the ribbon stirred and slipped from Maeve's hand of its own accord, as if remembering where to go. It draped itself along the lower branch again, this time nearer to Maeve's side, a pale thread mending a small seam. "You have a knack," said the Banshee, and there might have been the suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Not everyone thinks to offer the world back to itself." They were quiet a while longer. The sea brightened. a crease of silver under the far clouds. A lamb bleated once, as if surprised by its own voice. From the cottage came the soft thud of something settling, house timbers or memory. "Is he safe?" Maeve asked, and there was no tremor in the question. It was a practical inquiry, the kind you make at a harbour. Has the boat found its mooring? "He is where his love has shape," the woman answered. "The shape you made with your days. It is easier for those whose lives were mended while they lived." Maeve felt a knot she hadn't noticed soften and loosen. "Thank you," she said. "I do not grant it," said the woman. "I witness it." They might have finished there, both satisfied with the measure of their words, but the Banshee lifted her gaze toward the lane that led to the village and listened with her whole face. "They are coming," she said, a fondness in it, as a shepherd might have for a late flock. "The neighbours, with candles and broth." Maeve nodded. "We'll sit together. Tell the old stories." He liked the one about the mackerel run. "Tell it again," said the woman. "Stories are bridges built of breath. The crossing is lighter when the road is familiar." Maeve's hand rested on the stile, absorbing the cool of stone. She did not ask the next question, but the Banshee answered it anyway. "You will hear me once more," she said. "Not tonight. Soon enough that your heart will recognize the step and not stumble." Maeve let out a slow breath. "For whom?" "For no fear," said the woman. "For gratitude." The words settled like a shawl across Maeve's shoulders. She understood. There are tears that fall not because something is taken, but because something was given so completely that even the ending glows. The figure by the thorn shifted, no vanishing trick, no sudden blur. She simply became less necessary to the eye. The air closed around her as a lake's surface closes after a stone has entered, not erasing, but restoring. The old hawthorn kept on being hawthorn, honoured by what it had hosted. "Good evening," Maeve said again, because respect is a habit that makes a place gentle. "And a good keeping," the woman replied, the words like the warmth left in a chair. Then she let the field have her back. Maeve stood a moment longer, feeling the lane under her feet as if it were a living thing that appreciated company. When she turned toward home, the first of the neighbours was just topping the rise, Brid from the next farm, shawl pinned tight, a jar wrapped in a cloth in her hands. "Ah, girl," Brid called softly, because shouting breaks something that's better left whole. "We heard." "We've a fire and a kettle," Maeve answered. "Come in." They met at the door, the way weather meets thresholds, shared, negotiated, brought inside. Brid pressed the jar into Maeve's hands. "Broth," she said, "and candles. I brought the long ones, for sitting." Aidan, woken by voices, came blinking to the doorway. He looked between the women, then past them to the field and the old thorn holding its ribbons. Something eased in his shoulders, as if the world had nodded to him. "Sit then," Maeve said, setting the jar by the hearth. She lit 2 candles and placed them near the foot of the bed, then one on the table, the largest, so that even the shadows could see their way. The house filled again, footsteps careful on the stone, whispers that sounded like prayers even when they were grocery lists of what to bring tomorrow. When the tea was poured and the first stories began, Maeve glanced toward the window. Nothing unusual waited there, only evening, making itself comfortable. Yet she felt, just outside the frame, the lingering attention of a presence that did not need to look in order to see. She lifted her cup slightly, a quiet salute, and then turned back to the living, because that, she knew now, was part of the keening too. Inside, voices braided themselves into a soft rope meant for holding. Outside, the sea moved in its forever rhythm, and the old hawthorn stood like a sentinel who understands both duty and tenderness. And for a while, the cottage at the edge of the Western world became exactly what it needed to be, a room where sorrow sat down, was named, and, little by little, became gratitude. By the next morning, the world had reshaped itself again. The mist was gone, replaced by a sky of pale blue and drifting white, like pages turning in slow motion. The fields, damp and shining, looked as though the rain had pressed its memory into every blade of grass. The sea was calm, a deep grey-green, humming softly against the cliffs as if to itself. Inside the cottage the fire burned low, its red heart steady. The air smelled of candle wax, salt, and the faint sweetness of bread left cooling on the table. Maeve stood near the window, her shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Her eyes were soft, the kind that see both what is and what was without needing to separate them. Her father's body had been carried to the chapel at first light. The men from the village walked with careful reverence, their boots leaving dark tracks that would vanish with the day's warmth. Aidan had gone with them, his shoulders set, his hand steady on the cart handle. He was growing into his place in the world. Grief had not broken him, only deepened his quiet. Now the cottage was still, the kind of still that hums rather than rests. Maeve poured tea for one and sat by the hearth. The chair creaked familiarly, the same way it had under her father's weight every night for decades. The clock ticked in slow agreement. For the first time since the night of the cry, she allowed herself to do nothing, to simply be. As the light shifted through the window, she watched it trace the curve of the old table, the shine of the kettle, the simple, faithful things that make up a life. She felt no ache now, only a vast, quiet gratitude. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear her father's voice, not in memory, but in rhythm, the way he hummed without realizing it while mending nets, or how he used to speak softly to the sea, as though it were an old friend who had simply stepped outside for air. That hum still lingered, folded into the sounds around her, the low crackle of peat, the distant gulls, the sigh of wind through the thatch. She whispered into that hum, "You were right, Dar. The tide always turns." A gentle knock came at the door. Maeve rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened it. Standing there was Brid from the next farm, her shawl pulled close against the chill. Her eyes were kind, tired in the way of those who have known too many wakes and yet keep attending as an act of love. "I thought you might need company," she said softly. Maeve smiled. "You're always welcome." Brid stepped inside, bringing the scent of morning with her. She carried a small loaf wrapped in cloth and a candle in her other hand. "For the table," she said. They sat together by the hearth, not speaking at first. The silence between them was an old friend. After a while, Brid looked toward the window. "The mist lifted fast," she said. "It'll be a clear night." Maeve nodded. "It will." Brid hesitated, then asked, "Did you see her?" Maeve's gaze softened. "I did." Brid didn't look surprised. "And?" "She was kind," Maeve said, gentle as rain. Brid exhaled, her eyes closing briefly as though something inside her had been affirmed. Aye, that's the truth of her. People tell the story wrong, make her sound like doom itself, but she's not. She's the mercy that comes before it. She said she'd come again, Maeve murmured. Brid turned to her. You're not afraid? Maeve shook her head. No, not any more. They poured more tea and spoke of small things. The weather, the sheep, the coming harvest. Life weaving itself back together in quiet threads. When Brid left, she kissed Maeve's cheek and said, The light will be kind tonight. Sit by it a while. Maeve promised she would. As the sun began to lower, she walked the lane toward the thorn tree. The fields were silver with dew again, though the day had been warm. The hawthorn stood patient and eternal, its ribbons stirring softly in the breeze. She stopped beside it, pressing her hand to its trunk. The bark felt alive beneath her palm, rough, yes, but pulsing faintly like a heart in slow time. I've come to thank you, she whispered, not sure if she meant the tree, the spirit, or the world itself. The air shifted and the scent of lavender and sea spray rose faintly like breath drawn from memory. She smiled, not startled, and there she was, the Banshee, standing once more at the far side of the field, the same pale cloak, the same stillness that seemed to hold the whole horizon in its fold. You came, Maeve said. I said I would, replied the voice, the tone both close and distant, like wind through glass. Maeve walked a few steps closer. No one's gone today. I know. Then why are you here? The woman's gaze drifted toward the sea. To listen, she said. Sometimes the world sings when it learns to let go. I like to be near that sound. Maeve's throat tightened, but not from sadness. You could rest, you know. You've carried so much. The faintest smile crossed the Banshee's face. So have you. And yet, here you are. Maeve laughed quietly. Here I am. They stood in silence for a while. Two women, one living, one not quite, both made of what endures, love, patience, and the long remembering of both. The sun lowered itself into the sea, painting the water in ribbons of gold and rose. The light found the ribbons in the tree, and for a moment they shimmered like flame. Maeve felt her breath catch. It's beautiful, she said. It's what remains, the Banshee answered. All light is borrowed from what came before. She turned then, her figure thinning in the fading glow. Your house will be full again soon, with laughter, with story, with the ordinary holiness of days. That is my favourite part, when sorrow learns to make tea. Maeve smiled. Then you'll like this house. I already do, the woman said. The last of the sunlight touched her face, then drifted away. When Maeve blinked, she was gone. That night, Maeve sat by the hearth with Aidan. The windows were open, the stars reflected in the quiet black of the sea. The kettle hissed gently. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Grief had softened into something companionable, something that no longer demanded explanation. As the last peat ember glowed, Maeve whispered into the dark, "Thank you." And in the hush that followed, a faint, familiar hum answered, a note neither sad nor joyful, simply whole. Aidan looked up, half smiling. The wind? Maeve shook her head. No, she said softly, a blessing. The candlelight flickered once, brightened and steadied. The sound of the sea folded around the cottage like a lullaby. And in that quiet room where sorrow had been welcomed and love had stayed, the night breathed its peace over them both, gentle, patient, endless. The night deepens. The last of the candles burn low, their golden light curling against the walls like soft memory. The Banshee's voice has faded now, leaving only the hush she carried, that kind of silence that feels alive, like the breath of a world resting after song. Outside, the mist returns, rolling across the fields in pale ribbons. It touches the thorn tree, the cottage, the empty cup by the window. It carries with it a quiet promise that endings are only a way for the next beginning to find its place. And somewhere, beyond the hedgerows and the winding lanes, another story stirs. It begins not with sorrow, but with a question. A mother's question, whispered to the night when her child no longer feels like her own. The people of the old country call it the fairy faith, the belief that what we love most can be borrowed by the other world, tested, and sometimes returned, forever changed. So come closer now, let the sea winds hush behind us and follow the faint sound of a lullaby carried from a cottage at the edge of a deep green glen, where a mother rocks her baby and wonders if she's singing to a stranger. This is The Fairy Faith and the Changeling Child, a story of love that listens, of fear that softens, and of what happens when the heart learns that magic and grief often wear the same face. The glen held its own weather. You could stand at its edge and feel the world as the maps drew it. Broad fields, a sensible road, the smell of peat and bread, and then step 1 foot down the slope and discover the air had changed, cooler, greener, touched with fern breath and water light. The stream there moved like a ribbon laid carefully over stones, and the hawthorn kept watch the way certain trees do, with a patience that outlives stories. At the bottom of that soft bowl of land, a cottage leaned into the hill. Its thatch wore the seasons without complaint. Its small windows always looked as if they had just finished listening. On a late summer evening, while the last swallows stitched the sky and the cattle bells faded into distance, a woman sat in the doorway with a child in her arms and sang to the cooling light. Her name was Nuala. She was steady by nature, one of those people who could set a room to rights by crossing it, who believed in clean hands, warm bread, and saying thank you to the day at the sink. Her hair held the colour of barley at noon. Her eyes were the grey of the shore when the tide is thinking. She sang not because the child demanded it, but because music quieted the air enough to let love be heard. The child, a son, 10 months old, rested against her shoulder, heavy with the kind of sleep that drops the world without apology. His name was Aidan. He had been born in winter when the eaves wore clear daggers and the milk steamed in pails. He had grown through lambing and ladening, through the bright work of spring into the soft busyness of summer. His hands liked her hair. His breath liked the place where her collarbone rose. He had a way of making the house feel like a harbour. But lately something in that harbour had changed its tide. Nuala noticed it first in the small hours, when the moon thinned the dark and the kettle's memory still warmed the hob. Aidan woke not with the soft questioning chirr of a hungry child, but with a hush, as if he were listening to something just outside the window. His gaze would drift past her cheek to the shadowed corner where the butter churn stood, or to the sill where she kept a sprig of dried heather. Once he reached toward the door latch and smiled, though the door was quiet as a folded hand. "You see what I don't," she whispered, pressing her lips to his hair. "Teach me gently." By day he laughed and dozed and tugged at the fringe of her shawl as he had before, and still there were moments when he seemed newly made, as if the night had pressed him into a slightly different mould. The weight of him felt the same. The scent at his crown, that honeyed, milky truth of infants, remained. Yet the shape of his attention shifted, like a path the sheep had chosen that morning to move a few inches over. Nuala did not speak of it at once. There is a dignity in letting a question ripen. She watched and sang and kept the house with her usual care. She offered the first slice of oatcake to the hearth, the way her grandmother had taught her, and touched the doorpost with her fingertips when she went out. She left the water bowl brimming for travellers, seen and unseen. None of these acts felt like superstition to her. They felt like manners. On the third evening of noticing, she carried the child to the stream at the glen's edge. Sunlight softened as it passed under the hawthorn. The water moved with the unhurried purpose of something that knows its destination. Nuala knelt and let her hand trail in the current, then dipped her fingers and cooled Aidan's brow. "There now," she murmured. "If the day's been too bright on you, let the river remember you to yourself." A small drift of foam circled, broke, and went on. A wren scolded from the bramble and then forgave its own fussing. The baby's eyes followed the pattern of light on the water with a concentration that did not belong to tiredness. Nuala felt the featherweight of a thought land in her. He is here, and he is elsewhere, both true at once. On the path home she met old Brid, who knew every hedge by its given and secret names. Brid's shawl held the colour of rain before it falls. Her hands smelled of wool and nettle. She looked once at Aidan and once at Nuala, and smiled the thoughtful smile of someone counting not numbers but signs. "You're walking the low way," Brid said, as if they had been mid-conversation. "The air is good there," Nuala answered, "and the stream keeps its promises." Brid nodded. "And the hawthorn?" "I greet it and pass respectful." "As is right." Brid's gaze rested again on the child. "He has the look of the in-between about him tonight." Nuala did not bristle. She had asked the glen for gentle. The glen had sent honesty. "I've thought the same," she said, heart steadying aloud, "only I haven't named it." Brid's eyes softened. "Say the name, and it need not own you," she murmured. "There are nights when the other folk walk nearer. They borrow what the world does not hold tightly, not to harm, to test the edges. A cradle left under a window, a lullaby sung with the latch unbarred. Aye, there are old rules." Nuala listened the way stone listens to rain. Not to judge, only to learn how much of the sound to keep. "What would you do?" she asked. Brid considered the late light leaning on the hill. "The milk in the blue bowl by the hearth," she said. "A coal on the threshold so the door remembers its duty. Iron near the lintel, just a nail to remind the air that this is a house of work and kindness, and 3 white threads tied under the cradle, not for binding but for belonging." She paused, then added, "Sing his naming softly to the corners. It is good to remind the corners." Nuala felt calm move through her like a tide finding the right stones. "I can do that. And if the night plays tricks?" Brid asked, though her tone was not warning but companioning. "Then I will keep the rhythm," Nuala said. "He will know it by heart and follow it home." Brid's smile deepened. "You've the makings of a midwife to the unseen." They parted at the low gate, as neighbours do, with a touch of the hand and the exchange of something small. Brid gave a sprig of rowan, Nuala gave a heel of bread. The cottage accepted them back with its usual grace. The door's wooden sigh, the clock's gentle arithmetic, the kettle beginning to think of boiling. That night, Nuala worked with the humility of someone learning a craft. She set the blue bowl on the hearthstone and poured a measure of milk she could spare. She found an iron nail in the drawer where useful things gather: 2 lengths of twine, a spare button, a bit of beeswax, and tapped the nail into the lintel with a stone, careful not to wake the child. She tied 3 white threads beneath the cradle and laid the sprig of rowan on the sill. None of it felt like armour. It felt like hospitality with a longer memory. Then she sat in the chair by the cradle and began to sing, not a song of pleading, not a charm with sharp corners, but the simple tune she had hummed since he first turned toward her voice. Between verses, she spoke his name to the 4 corners of the room, the way her grandmother had taught, to the window, to the door, to the hearth, to the bed. "Aidan," she said, soft but sure. "Aidan of my arms, Aidan of this roof, Aidan of bread and light and good work." The room held her words like a bowl holds water. The shadows did nothing unusual. The candle burned in the good shape of a candle. Still, she felt the air listening, as if another listener sat just beyond the reach of sight, hands folded, approving of how the music settled. Near midnight, when the kettle had cooled and the stars had taken their time arriving, Aidan stirred. His eyes opened, not all at once, but in a widening that seemed to recall something. He looked straight at her, and for the first time in days, Nuala recognized her son looking back without distance, his gaze landing and staying, the way a bird chooses a branch and digs in lightly with its small feet. "There you are," she breathed, the praise no louder than breath. "There you are." He made the soft sound that belonged only to him, a small vowel like a lifted cup. He reached for her face and found her nose, her cheek, the edge of her lip, as if redrawing the map he liked best. Relief did not rush her. It flowed, quiet and thorough, like warm water over cold hands. She kept the rhythm. She did not snatch him up as joy urged. She waited a verse, then another, then lifted him when both their breathing had agreed. He settled to her shoulder with the old, perfect weight, and she stood and walked the length of the small room as though measuring it for grace. On her third pass by the window, a pale movement touched the corner of her vision, the kind of soft shift that could be moth or mist or a thought deciding to have a shape. Nuala stopped, turned her face just enough to see the glass without seeing past it, and nodded once, the nod people give to the postman and the priest alike. Respect, not invitation. Gratitude, not bargain. "Thank you for the loan of a lesson," she said quietly. "We'll keep him in the ways we know." The moth, if moth it was, lodged itself in the shadow of the frame and became indistinguishable from night. The house exhaled. The hawthorn outside sighed the way old wood sighs when rain has left it and the moon begins to listen. Nuala laid the child back in his cradle and touched the 3 white threads with one finger. "Belonging," she reminded them, and herself. She set the blue bowl a little nearer the hearth so the milk would warm enough to scent the room. She dimmed the candle to a small bright coin. Before sleep she walked to the door and placed a coal on the threshold, a tiny red heart between inside and out. It winked once, as if amused by its appointment, and then settled to the serious work of reminding the night that a home is a promise kept in both directions. When Nuala lay down, the bed met her like an agreement. Behind her lids, the glen kept its green, the stream kept its ribboned whisper. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, the old stories kept their own kind of watch, not to frighten, but to keep the edges from fraying. And in the cradle, the unfamiliar became familiar again, as gently as dawn becoming day. The glen slipped into late summer, gold around the edges, bees drunk on clover, the stream silvering itself beneath the sun. Nuala went about her work, kneading bread, turning hay, singing to the air so the walls would remember they were loved. Aidan thrived again, or so it seemed. His cheeks grew pink, his hands plump with purpose. He laughed often, that quick, startled laughter of babies discovering they are delighted by sound. But sometimes when she carried him past the hawthorn tree, he would grow quiet, his small face turned toward the branches as if listening to a voice she could not hear. One afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the glen, Nuala met old Brid again by the well. The older woman leaned on her walking stick, her shawl pinned with a brooch shaped like a tiny fish. The air smelled of peat smoke and lavender drying in nearby gardens. "Ah," Brid said, smiling. "He looks strong now." "He is," Nuala said, adjusting Aidan on her hip. "Thank you for your wisdom that night. The milk, the threads, the nail, they brought peace." Brid nodded. "Peace listens to what is tended." "You did the tending." She looked toward the hills, her gaze narrowing thoughtfully. "Still," she added softly, "the glen keeps its whisper." Nuala hesitated. "You mean the fair ones?" "Them, or what they remind us of," Brid said. "There are places where the worlds brush close. Yours is one." Nuala followed her gaze to the hawthorn at the edge of her land. The breeze played through its branches, and a shimmer passed through the leaves. Not light, not shadow, but something between. Brid saw her watching and smiled gently. "Don't be afraid of it. Fear feeds what is better starved. Respect it, and it will respect you." Nuala nodded, repeating the words in her mind like a prayer. When she looked back toward the tree, the shimmer had faded. That night, Nuala could not sleep. The cottage was warm and silent, the fire a red whisper. She lay listening to Aidan's breathing, steady, soft, sure. Yet beneath it she thought she heard another rhythm, not a voice, but the shape of one. It came and went like the pulse of the tide. Once she could have sworn it said her name, not aloud, not in her ear, but somewhere near her heart. Nu-Allah. She rose quietly and went to the door, lifting the latch with care. The night opened around her, a soft sea of dark, alive with the scent of damp grass and the faint sweetness of wild honeysuckle. The moon had not yet risen, and the stars looked like salt scattered by some invisible cook. Down by the stream, a pale glimmer moved. It might have been mist, or someone walking, but there was no sound of feet, only the brush of wind over water. Nuala watched until her eyes grew wet from staring. Then she whispered, "If you're watching, watch kindly." And the glimmer paused, just once, as though it had heard. The next morning dawned clear and kind. She made oatcakes, humming, her hands steady again. Sometimes she wondered if the night had been a dream, the kind born of tiredness and love too large to fit in daylight. Later she carried Aidan to the stream once more. He reached for the water, laughing as sunlight danced on its surface. The air felt lighter now, as though the glen had exhaled. Bride joined her there, leaning on her stick. "You've walked through the edge of it," the older woman said quietly. "Few do so without losing their way." "I didn't walk far," Nuala said. "I only opened the door." Bride smiled. "That's far enough. They know your courtesy now. They'll not trouble you if you remember to live gently." "I can do that," Nuala said. Bride bent to the stream and flicked a few drops onto the air. "Then you'll be well kept." They stood together for a while, listening to the water's slow language. That evening, as dusk settled over the glen, Nuala noticed something new. Near the cradle, the blue bowl she had left by the hearth was empty, clean to the rim, though she hadn't touched it. She smiled, not startled. "Good manners," she said softly, pouring fresh milk and setting it down again. "There's plenty for all who mean well." The candlelight wavered once, not as though disturbed, but as though acknowledging, and the room grew calm, almost musical, the way a room feels when gratitude has just passed through it. Nuala lifted Aidan and held him close. He smelled of milk and sun and safety. Outside, the hawthorn moved gently in the wind. She began to hum again, the same tune she'd sung since his birth, and as she did, a faint echo joined her, light, distant, and perfectly in time. Two voices, one heard, one half imagined, weaving together through the small cottage at the edge of the whispering glen. Autumn settled over the glen like a shawl laid across a sleeping shoulder. The heather browned, the bracken goldened, and the hawthorn put away its leaves with quiet dignity. The air turned to honeyed chill, not cruel but instructive, reminding hands to light fires early and hearts to move slowly through dusk. Nuala's cottage held that change the way a hearth holds flame by understanding it. The days became smaller, the tasks gentler, the silence deeper in its kindness. Each morning she rose before dawn, when the world still wore its dream. She baked bread, mended nets, sang to the corners as she did her work. Aidan, growing strong and sure, followed her from chair to table, his steps unsteady but certain of their welcome. When he laughed, the sound filled the house like fresh light. When he fell, he cried just long enough to learn courage. He was, as Bride said, a child well measured, half wonder, half dirt under the nails. And though Nuala no longer feared what shadows might hover near her window, she still kept her small customs. The blue bowl by the hearth was never empty long. The 3 white threads beneath the cradle, now tucked beneath Aidan's small bed, were changed with every season, and the iron nail above the door shone with honest rust. They were not superstitions, these gestures. They were gratitude. Every thread, every drop of milk was a way of saying thank you to what had passed and to what still watched kindly. One evening, as twilight softened the edges of the hills, Nuala stood by the door with her shawl drawn tight. The air smelled of peat and apples. Aidan slept already, a small star under his blanket. From the road, a figure approached, a young woman in a green cloak carrying a bundle. Her face was tired, her steps uncertain. When she reached the gate, she hesitated, glancing toward the hawthorn as if asking permission. Nuala recognized that look. The half-belief, half-fear of one who has been keeping questions too long in her chest. "Evening to you," Nuala called softly. The woman startled, then smiled weakly. "Evening. She hesitated, clutching the bundle closer. "They said you might know things." "Some things," Nuala said, kind but not proud. "Come in out of the chill." The woman crossed the threshold carefully, the way one steps into a chapel. Inside, the cottage welcomed her, the scent of bread and lavender, the hum of the kettle, the soft light of a single candle. Nuala gestured toward a chair. "Sit, child, you've come away." The woman set the bundle, a sleeping baby, in her lap. "He's been different," she whispered, "since the last full moon. Quiet when he should laugh, laughing when he should sleep. He looks the same, but his eyes, they wander." Nuala nodded slowly. "You've been afraid to say it aloud." Tears rose uninvited. "I thought I was mad. My husband says it's just growing pains, but a mother knows the weight of her own child. He feels borrowed." Nuala reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not mad. You're awake." The woman blinked. Then you've walked into a story," Nuala said gently, "but not one that means harm. The world tests its keepers. The fair ones borrow what love won't hoard. They touch, they weigh, they watch, and if the mother's heart holds steady, as yours will, the balance returns." The woman's shoulders trembled. "How do I hold steady?" "By remembering you already are," Nuala said. She rose and crossed to the hearth. "We'll start simple. Milk in the blue bowl, a coal on the threshold, iron above the door, 3 threads beneath the cradle, white for belonging, red for courage, gold for gratitude." She moved as she spoke, setting each thing in place. The visitor watched, calm stealing over her like dawn finding a field. "And sing," Nuala said, turning back, "not for defence, for welcome. Let your song remind the house whose love it shelters." "I don't know what to sing," the woman said, voice breaking. Nuala smiled. "Then hum until you do. The heart always remembers its tune." When the baby stirred, Nuala bent and looked into his face. His eyes opened, dark, fathomless, watching her the way the stream had once watched the stars. For a breath, she thought she saw recognition there, something older than infancy, something that remembered both sides of the door. "You're a wise one," she murmured, "but even the wise need home." The baby blinked, sighed, and fell asleep again. Nuala straightened. "You'll be fine," she said softly. "The hardest part is not believing, it's believing kindly." The woman nodded, tears falling soundlessly. "You've done this before." "Once," Nuala said, smiling, "and I was not alone." By the time the young mother left, the moon had risen, pale and whole, brushing silver over the glen. She paused at the gate, looking back at the cottage. "You've given me peace," she said. "No," Nuala replied. "You had it all along. I just pointed you toward it." The woman looked at the hawthorn, then back to her. "Will I see you again?" "If the world decides we need to share another story," Nuala said. Until then, live gently. The woman nodded and began down the lane, her baby close against her heart. Nuala watched until the mist took them both. Back inside, the fire had burned low, the way fires do when their audience is content. She poured a little milk into the blue bowl and added a drop of honey. For the road, she said to the air. The shadows moved, not closer, not away, just enough to say we heard. Aidan stirred in his bed, murmuring something that might have been her name. She went to him, tucking the blanket up to his chin. You'll grow into a world that listens, she whispered, because you'll know how. He sighed and slept. Nuala sat for a while by the window, watching the stars bloom and fade, like breath, like song, like the endless rhythm between worlds. She thought of the woman in the glen, the fey keeper in her dream, the long line of mothers who had tended both the seen and unseen with equal tenderness. Her life was small, yes, but in that smallness, vastness hid, folded neatly between the threads of belonging she had learned to tie. When she finally rose to bank the fire, she looked once more to the hawthorn, standing patient against the night. "Good night, friend," she said. "Thank you for the lesson." The branches moved just once, as though nodding back. And so, in a quiet valley between earth and other world, a mother, her child, and a single old tree kept the rhythm that keeps everything alive, to love without owning, to tend without fear, to sing what you mean. The glen listened, the stars leaned closer, and the night folded itself into peace. And so the stories rest. The sea is quiet now. The hills sleep beneath their quilt of mist. The voices that have carried us, of swans and selkies, of lovers and watchers, of mothers and unseen guests, drift gently back into the hush from which they came. Each tale began in longing, and each one ended in belonging. The children of Lir found their peace at last upon still waters. The Selkie Bride returned to the tide that first knew her name. Tam Lin, held through every transformation, remembered the strength of human hands. The Banshee sang sorrow into grace, teaching that love does not end when the body rests. And in the glen, where the world brushes softly against its own reflection, a mother learned that faith is nothing more than gentleness practiced again and again. These are not just old stories, they are the slow heartbeat of the land itself. They remind us that every loss carries a light, every ending holds a door, and every kindness, no matter how small, mends something unseen. So as you settle now, let your breath match the rhythm of the tide. Let your thoughts soften like mist over the hills, and know that you, too, are part of this long and patient story, the one where everything eventually finds its way home. This has been Sleepy Stories. May these timeless tales carry you into dreams filled with peace, warmth, and returning light. Good night.